7 o'clock on the Pacific time zone. It's 10 o'clock Eastern, so we wanted to start promptly. I know there are people still coming in, but I wanted to get going. So I want to thank all of you for coming and supporting this event, and I'd also really like to thank UNLV for allowing us to use their facility, which is quite lovely, however difficult to find. I want to thank the folks who have been here volunteering, Linda and An and Ricky and all the people who are, all these events that we do are put on with volunteers, so it's a labor of love for everyone. I'd like to thank them for their help. They've been helping me all weekend. This presentation is a follow-on to what I presented about a year ago in Washington on the deep national security state and the UFO and extraterrestrial issue. How many people saw that? And I'm just curious. So it's a good thing to look at. You may want to see it again in light of what I'm going to be sharing tonight. And what I want to share tonight is personally very difficult. And the reason it is that this issue and this presentation will be the most difficult one I've done in 26 years. It will be very controversial. It's, as a trauma doctor, an emergency doctor, I tell people I'm accustomed to giving folks bad news. So this is very, very bad news. And I'm not saying that to be at all melodramatic. I'm telling you what the truth is. And the only reason I'm doing this is that there have been information coming in pinging my system indicating that we're getting closer to the hoaxing of events to stampede the world into something that would make 9/11 look like a picnic. And there are a number of signs that have been mounting on this issue over the last 6 to 9 months. And I'm gravely concerned about it. So for that reason, without being able to say that anything is imminent, my philosophy has always been an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And in this case, it's an ounce of prevention is worth several billion planets worth of cure in terms of mass. Because if we can do what we should tonight and get the word out about this to the President-elect, to the incoming Director of Central Intelligence, to people in the Kremlin who are watching, to people all over the world, there's a chance we can avoid what I'm going to be discussing. So it's a bit like if you were to tell someone they have some signs for a massive heart attack, all right? And it's imminent. And you can do some things right now, prevent it. You can ignore it and have it and have a code blue where the heart stops and you have to be resuscitated. My goal here, using that medical analogy a little further, is to avoid the attack. And in this case, it would not be a medical emergency. It would be a national security and global emergency orchestrated by people who have been planning this since the 1950s. So what I'm going to be discussing is what in the parlance of the Pentagon, CIA, counterintelligence programs is known as a false INW, or a deceptive INW, or indication and warning. And some years ago, I had a meeting, and it's pop culture, we call it false flag. Some years ago, I had a meeting with the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency and General Patrick Hughes, and the focus of that briefing, which was quite extensive, was to give him information so that he would not be deceived in the event of a false or deceptive INW, indication and warning, dealing with the UFO and ET issue. As it turned out, the general had no knowledge of either the UFO issue, the extraterrestrial issue, or the fact that there was already afoot, planned since the 1950s, a program, a longitudinal, long-term, multi-generational program to hoax a threat from outer space when there was none, or is none. This was something that the general was very concerned about, because prior to the meeting I'd sent a briefing through courier to the general. He's a 3-star. And he was unaware of any of these issues. And he sort of mirrored what he said, almost word for word, what the first director of the CIA that I briefed in 1993 said, and that is, I have made inquiries into this issue, but I have been provided no information. And at that point, he goes over to a bookshelf in the meeting room for the general, which is in the E ring of the Pentagon, picks up a doll, a little E.T. doll, looks like one of those little things you get at a toy store, and he held it up, and he was, with great anger, said, "This is all I have gotten for my inquiries on the UFO issue." And it was, of course, people making fun of him. And I said, yes, that's typical. However, there are people on your senior staff who are permanently assigned to this directorate, to being the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, whereas the director rotates, just like the CIA director rotates. And they know about it, but they're not telling you because they want to keep you in the dark. At that instant, a full bird colonel who was at the briefing stiffened visibly and became quite agitated, but remained silent. And my military advisor and I afterwards compared notes and said, that man is the gatekeeper, deceiving the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. Now that little vignette multiplied all throughout the dysfunction of governments around the world. And so you have people who often, you would think, who would have knowledge of these issues. And it turns out they do not. And then there are other people who should have nothing to do with something this sensitive, who are running the projects outside constitutional oversight of the President, the Congress, and their appointees, and of we, the people, most importantly. This is why Admiral Roscoe Hillenkoetter, the first CIA director when it was formed in 1947, took the place of the OSS, said in a letter that the secrecy surrounding UFOs was a threat to the national security. This is why Eisenhower said the secrecy, unwarranted secrecy is what he said. It could be a threat to our democracy and our way of life. And they were referring to this dynamic. So what we have to do as the people, and I'm a citizen, I mean, contrary to rumors, I don't do anything except pro bono free briefings for people in government when they ask me because they found out, oops, this stuff is true, who can I go to and find out what's really going on? And I'll be called into a briefing. But the problem is, in that vacuum of secrecy, extreme, illegal, unacknowledged special access projects, which is what they're called, at a compartmented level, and I was talking to a gentleman today about this, at least 21 levels, compartments, past the level of the President. 21 levels. That you have a permanent infrastructure that has evolved or spun off from the legitimate government, but that is embedded within the corporate sector, the intelligence community, and the military sector, that has run amok viciously of our liberties and our freedoms, and have therefore been given no oversight or restraints so that they could set up a dynamic where they could hoax an alien attack on planet Earth. Now, this is going to be very complicated, and it's going to be the most complex presentation I've ever done. It's going to be intellectually dense, so we will take a break at the 2-hour point, stretch our legs, come back for some question and answers, because it's going to be heavy stuff. Now, I want to be really clear. that when this I'm sharing is, I would not do it if I didn't think it could be avoided. I would just keep my mouth shut and retire. I think we can avert this. I think that we can avoid the heart attack, as it were, using the analogy I used earlier. And that's why I'm standing here before you. Otherwise, I would have given up on this in 1994 when I first learned of all of these issues. So in 1994, by that date, I had learned that there was a sub rosa, deep national security state operation, that had completely gotten out of control. So badly that when I brought this up to the general who was in charge of the Defense Intelligence Agency, General Patrick Hughes, he said, yes, my father in the 60s knew of such a thing that had happened. We all thought he was a kook. We didn't believe him. He says, it wasn't until I got into this command as head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is almost as big as the CIA, maybe bigger. That's the Pentagon shop for intelligence versus CIA civilian. And he said to me that, that his father eventually committed suicide over this issue. So, very heavy. I mean, this is 10 minutes into the briefing. This 3-star general sharing this intimate and devastating fact. And I said, well, I can understand that. You know, I mean, a lot of people have. So I said, but we can't, and he said to me, he says, how have you stayed in this game? I said, I put my vision on the far horizon. And the far horizon is that we're going to make it through this in fits and starts, and we're going to have a new civilization begin on this planet, the hallmark of which is a peaceful planet on Earth, living peacefully with these other planets. Now, to get from where we are now, which is that criticality, we would call it medically, to get from criticality now to that point is going to be a very heavy lift. But he said to me, he said, well, I'm glad you have that hope, because otherwise I don't know how you haven't eaten your gun. That's what he said. I said, well, it's not my style anyway. But I said, but the point is that there's no point in despairing, because what I have seen, and this is the part of me that's sort of the spirit warrior and my lucid dreams of the future, is a future where these issues have resolved. We have a peaceful civilization here. There's free energy running the planet. There's anti-gravity systems, so we move above the surface and don't need surface roads. Poverty is ended. There is complete economic and social justice in the world, and a sustainable, clean planet that becomes a level 1, as Michikaku would say, planet that can go forward and go into space peacefully. That's what I see happening. And within my lifetime, and I'm kind of an old guy now, so when I started this project, I was 34, and I'm 61. So I point out to people, this has been, you know, a 26, 27-year period of work, and it pulled me out of my work as an emergency doctor because I realized that we were in a global emergency. And that's why I left medicine. Get it? I mean, I went from one emergency to another. So it's sort of a dharma, a path of service to be involved in an emergency. So, but the cosmic false flag that I want to talk about is the crown jewel of the secrecy that was hatched in the 50s that led to Eisenhower losing control of these programs. And no president since that time has had full operational access control. They've had knowledge, but not control over these rogue elements. So now we're 60 years into a period where these operations have run amok, so much so that it has become an existential threat to life on Earth. And this is something we have to understand what the modus operandi is. What are the means for achieving this goal? And I was asked today by a gentleman I was meeting with, he says, when do you think they might do this? I say they began in 1950 something. It's already happened. It's already happened. The false flag has already happened. happened. Now, not the crescendo moment, not the final act, all right? But acts 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, whatever, have already transpired. What do I mean by that? What I mean is these operations figured out that the psychological warfare value of this subject was such that they could set up events that are completely hoaxed, beginning in the 50s and 60s, that would convince people that those events were of extraterrestrial origin, alien, when they were not. And so blur the lines between the actual ET activity and the human stagecraft, as it's called, that most people, including people at the White House, wouldn't know the difference. And I began speaking of this in the 90s. Those of you who are around, I see Ricky there and a few others who are around the 90s. I began speaking about this, and I would often say, is it real or is it Memorex? You know, the old commercial for Memorex tapes when there used to be tapes and not digital. And the problem is, who is doing a test, an assay, to see whether it's fool's gold or real gold? The problem is certainly not UFO subculture, and certainly not the media. No one in government I know, for the most part, has a clue. Even mid-level people, functionaries, within the majority intelligence committee, MAGIC, M-A-J-I-C, that runs these operations, do not know about this. Okay, Majestic, it's MAGIC, M-A-J, okay, the Majority Intelligence Committee, M-A-J-I-C. That's on the NRO document. That's the first document that's in the brief that went to Obama via Podesta, the campaign chairman for Hillary, or the former presidential candidate, Hillary, and also to Mr. Trump this past summer. So we try to stay ahead of the curve, and we saw this coming. So one of the, we can talk about this later, that's conventional politics, boring, but important. But, all right, but you have to deal with it. Now, these false flag operations, and I do like the term deceptive indication and warning, very military, very precise. By the way, you mentioned that to anyone who's in counterintelligence and military intelligence, they're going to know what it means. Why? Because this is nothing new. Do you think this is the first time this has happened? You ever heard of something called the Vietnam War? How many people heard of Vietnam War? Well, I was talking to a college graduate not long ago who never heard of Watergate or President Nixon. So, all right, so there was something called the Vietnam War, and nobody reads anymore. And during that period, we were of course first we had some advisors in there. Kennedy wanted to pull us out, was assassinated. Johnson was reluctant to expand, and so they hoaxed an event or exaggerated an event called the Gulf of Tonkin incident. So get your history books open, but you can Google it. This is mainstream stuff, not conspiracy theory. And the Gulf of Tonkin, basically what we did, we hoaxed and exaggerated the attack on our ships in the Gulf of Tonkin, there near Vietnam, so that it would cause outrage in the public, outrage in Congress, and it stampeded President Johnson into vastly expanding our presence in Vietnam, which of course enriched, guess who? The military, industrial, financial, gang-bankster complex. So trillions of dollars are at stake here. So, and it happened to cost 58,000 American lives and probably several million Southeast Asian lives on a misadventure that was completely based on a hoaxed or an exaggerated event. You ever heard of something called 9/11? Who was alive when that happened? Any children here not alive? I've talked to some people. Well, when 9/11 happened, And I don't want to go too far into this, except to say I have a gentleman who was the third highest ranking man at the Naval Research Labs, who prior to 9/11, in the Vice President's office, Vice President Cheney's, saw all the plans for 9/11 prior to it occurring. He's deceased, since I'm talking about it now. I did not talk about it for years. And he was told, he used to stay at my home. He said, look, I was told my wife and my children, my grandchildren would be killed along with me if I ever mentioned this. He took it to his grave, gave me the information. God bless him, Rick Foch, who was a very high-ranking scientist, an aerospace figure in the Naval Research Labs, which is the biggest Department of Defense lab. So when 9/11 happened, which was about 4 or 5 months after the 2001 disclosure event, where we had hundreds of thousands of people contacting Congress to hold hearings on this issue, which of course when 9/11 happened, that fell way to the back burner very quickly. And they then said, well, we got to go get those guys in Afghanistan. Then they did something else, another false flag. They concocted false intelligence, yellow cake, remember the story of yellow cake, uranium out of Africa. They made up all these stories. And they put poor Colin Powell up before the UN holding a vial of anthrax and other biological and chemical weapons, saying that Saddam Hussein in Iraq had these. He did not. And he was put up there thinking that he was being provided accurate intelligence when he was not. And there are people on the inside who have come forward saying that they knew that that intelligence was wrong or very likely wrong. But based on that, we went into Iraq, where we are still embroiled, blew up that whole area of the world. Now we have ISIS. And this was all planned and known with malice aforethought. So we don't have to reach back thousands of years with Trojan horses and machinations of Machiavellian psychopaths who have been militarists in the course of human history. We only need gaze back from Vietnam to today to see the extent to which these false flag operations, hoaxed events, exaggerated threats can stampede a populace and the Congress and the presidency into very dangerous and bad decisions. Now, the mother lode, the sort of the crown jewel of that kind of event is what has been planned assiduously since the 1950s, and that is a threat from outer space that is alien, that would unite the world around a military junta, a militarism, that would put all of humanity together, but against one or more extraterrestrial races. Now that plan, which they came up with in the 1950s, has been very carefully rolled out. And as you know from my friend Carol Rosin, who was Werner von Braun, the man who invented the rocket for Adolf Hitler, the V-2 rocket, and who then was brought in under Operation Paperclip by the OSS into our intelligence community and into our aerospace program after World War II. She said that on his deathbed, he said, look, first they had this plan, there would be the Cold War, and we could have had peace with the Soviet Union. Then there would be nations of concern and global terrorism. This we put out prior to 9/11, by the way. Then they would pull out the big one, and that is the threat from outer space. And it's all a lie. And that's what he kept saying, it's all a lie. And now when Carol Rosin first told me that, I said, yes, I know that. She said, you know about this already? I said, yes, I learned about this in 1993 and 1994. And she said, well, what are we going to do? I said, well, what can we do? We have to expose it. We have to expose the big lie. And if we do that, perhaps we can fulfill what The Who said when they had the famous song, we won't be fooled again. But it turns out we were fooled again. They were singing about the Vietnam War, of course. Everybody know that song, We Won't Be Fooled Again? I'm not a good singer. Anyway, but I went to go see them, actually, in Atlanta when I was an 18-year-old, and they sang that song. And it was very interesting because everyone thought, well, we're going to learn that lesson in Vietnam. We forgot it. And we had Iraq, and we forgot it. So they let a certain amount of time goes by, the population becomes complacent, we have a very short-term memory on such things, and then they move another one forward. The reason this one is the big one, that has been very well planned, and what I'm going to share tonight is going to ruin some very big plans if it's taken seriously. So what I'm telling you is extraordinarily dangerous. I mean, this is, if you were to rank this on a scale of 1 to 10 of sensitive, compartmented intelligence, information, this is as high as it goes, 10. Now, I've had it confirmed, and it's going to be in our movie Unacknowledged. And by the way, all of you who've contributed to that, thank you very much. It's going forward well. We have to have finished in about a month and then released late winter, early spring 2017. So one of the people that's going to be in this movie is an Air Force Office of Special Investigations counterintelligence officer who confirms the false flag. Name, rank, serial number. Confirms the military's involvement in staging the abductions of humans, making it look alien. Confirms that he carried bags of cash to people in the mainstream media to influence stories and coverage of this issue. And that's not the only data point we have. The key thing to understand here, I'm discussing all of this because I don't know how much time we have. And releasing a full-length feature film takes some time. But this needs to get out now because we have a new president coming in. That's why I'm here. And it's rolling down the track. This plan is on track. Now, when they began to discover, and I want to put this into 3 categories. You have assets that are material, stagecraft. And let's call these advanced aircraft of man-made origin, all right? And I'm going to show you some tonight. And it will blow your mind, and it should. But things like this. Man-made, anti-gravity, going all the way back to the late 50s and 60s. Triangular, disc, boomerang, etc. I suspect one of the world's experts on that issue is in the audience today, and I want to acknowledge him, by the way, Michael Schratt, who spent decades studying this and has put together by far the most comprehensive dossier and research that I have ever seen on the issue, and that's why he's here in the audience. Thank you, Michael. Now, what you need to understand is the gentleman I referred to and other people have confirmed this time period to me, that around October 1954, we attained gravity control. So gravity control meaning electromagnetic systems that affect an object so it becomes seemingly weightless, levitates, and corrects for gravity. Now, that research actually began with T. Townsend Brown and others in the 20s, if you look into this. And the Kolosky-Frost experiment in Germany and others were using very high voltage, high frequency systems at certain hertz, cycles per second, that would cause a change in the atomic structure and the magnetic field in such a way that you could essentially cancel mass. Okay, so without boring people with a physics lesson, if you make something close to massless, no weight, but weight is different from mass, massless, then you can accelerate it at enormous speeds with very little power. And it can go right-hand turns, go up and down, and if you can control for the interior, at 1G, in other words, one gravitational field, then you can go at 100,000 miles per hour, make a right-hand turn, and your brains don't come out of your ears, which was what would happen in a jet aircraft. So that work was being done in open source and then classified projects since the late 20s. The secret weapon that we had was the atomic bomb. The secret weapon Adolf Hitler was working on was this. Okay. And the so-called Nazi bell, they never got it stabilized. Now, so it would lift up and move around. We have video footage of it. It'll be in the film, actual footage. However, they never got it stable enough to do a lot with it. So Werner von Braun, Hermann Oberth, and others who'd worked at Pinatubo and these other facilities for the Germans in World War II were brought into, instead of being executed, like many Nazis were, they were brought into our intelligence community, into our aerospace community. And some of them, unfortunately, took it over from inside. So in a sense, we're living through the Fourth Reich. We defeated World War II, was the Third Reich, Nazis, but they learned to, instead of clumsily stumbling around doing it that way, they went subterranean. So the globe today is a Fourth Reichian fascist order. Now, I say this with no pleasure, and I am not speaking hyperbole. And that is the problem. It's a very huge problem. And there are all kinds of actors and players that have glommed on to that agenda. A bizarre collection of people from different walks of life and different agendas. We'll get into this later. But the secrecy around this issue has only been partial. They have been wanting a certain acculturation around UFOs and ETs for the purpose of having the public think that it could be true, but they don't really know what it is. So right now, more than half the public, over this longitudinal, long-term psychological propaganda warfare program launched in the 50s, believe UFOs are real. They believe there's intelligent life in the universe. But that's about where the granular knowledge ends. There's not a lot of granular knowledge, detailed knowledge of what all this is. And the truth is that this area of anti-gravity, let's call it, for pop culture usage, EMGs, electromagnetogravitics, gravity control, this became the focus of the aerospace industry and actually was reported open source in aerospace journals in the late 40s and early 50s, and then it went all black. This is a documented fact. Why did it go black? Because they finally figured out how to master it, and they didn't need to have more people joining in. So they wanted to close off that discussion. So in October 1954, gravity control was mastered, and we began to build various prototypes of what the public would call UFOs. And some were made to simulate the shape, appearance, and motion of an extraterrestrial vehicle. Because what better way to confuse people than to have something that looks almost the same? Is it gold? Is it fool's gold? Is it real? Is it Memorex? Get where I'm going here? This is how the spy masters operate. And luckily for them, and unfortunately for us, with the absence of the Fourth Estate and independent science and independent oversight from the public interest, the Commonwealth, they've been able to get away with enormous deception since the 50s. So I call those the assets that are material physical craft. Now that's one category. We'll return to this. There's another category, and this is more difficult to understand, and that is electromagnetic assets. And these include electromagnetic systems that could optically, like a very advanced hologram, simulate an event. electromagnetic systems that have been called popularly electronic warfare systems that are psychotronic and radionic that interface with consciousness and thought, and electromagnetic systems that can affect large segments of the population when targeted. Now, these began to be developed quite in an advanced fashion by the 40s and 50s. And by 1956, it had been accomplished to the point of state-of-the-art. So about a year after I was born. And then the other asset, the third category, is human intelligence, human assets. And these are folks who, some wittingly, some unwittingly, have been provided with a script and experiences that they honestly believe are real, but that have been programmed and are like very advanced consciousness holographic experiences. If you will, electronic hallucinations. And we'll get into this also. This gets into some issues that are going to make me very unpopular with some folks. I don't care. I mean, we don't have time for that. I don't care if you like me, love me, hate me. People got to know the truth on this. So I really don't. I'm not running for mayor of Crazy Town. I just want just want the truth out because we can't afford this childishness. Now, so those three categories in general are what we're going to focus on. First, let's talk about the air forms, let's call them, material assets, that are being made by Lockheed Martin Skunk Works, Northrop Grumman, my uncle's old company, Boeing, Phantom Works, etc. And I have many, many people who have worked in these aerospace programs, also at EG&G here. I mean, we're in Las Vegas, in the Nellis Range, so-called Area 51's up the road. It's an old facility, but we'll talk about which facilities are key. But those military and corporate contractors have always had compartmented operations dealing with this, going back to after World War II. Now, some of the material that was being done by the Nazis with the so-called Nazi Bell that was anti-gravity, but it was not well controlled, and they hadn't developed it well by the end of the war. We detonated the first atomic bomb first. Began to get more and more perfected. And as I mentioned, by 1954, gravity control was attained. At that point, we had a race to see how we could, how many of these forms we could develop, and the research between the mid-40s and the mid-50s was augmented, assisted, or propelled forward by the reverse engineering and study in a separate compartment of so-called extraterrestrial materiel. I'm referring now to things that some of you have heard about, like certainly the Roswell crash, Kingman, Arizona event. There are others that have happened, and these objects, which were downed with electronic warfare systems, they didn't just fly in and crash in an electrical storm. That's a myth. You don't go through interstellar space and come into the atmosphere of Earth and, oops, I can't navigate, and then just suddenly crash. And it happens to be right by the only atomic bomb squadron in the world in Roswell, New Mexico. That was the only, 509th Bomber Squadron was the only place in the world at the time of that event. And the interstellar civilizations were worried about what is going on Earth, because when we detonated those bombs, it was picked up by them. And they came. And they're here. And they're worried. And they should be worried. So that's what opened up the modern era of UFO extraterrestrial activity. And this is why you need to call this what it is. There's two things here. There's, UFO is a sort of a general phrase. It just means an unidentified flying object. Well, it's unidentified only to people who are not informed. They don't fly in any normal sense of the aerodynamics flying of a plane, but they are objects. So the only true part of the word UFO is O, and the rest is an obfuscation. So a blurring of the truth. But if you use that pop culture term of UFO, there are two types. Man-made ones here, interstellar extraterrestrial ones here. And you can tell the difference if you get up close enough, if you know what you're looking for. And we'll talk about that. The ones that were being developed by these early aerospace and research efforts were then benefited by studying the extraterrestrial objects that we began to learn how to use electromagnetic scalar longitudinal systems. Now, I'm not going to get into a big physics discussion here except to say the light you're seeing here is in a wave like this, right? So you have a wavelength, and so you have all kinds of spectra. Infrared, ultraviolet, visible spectra, different. A laser is coherent light. So a green laser is all the green, and it's coherently propagating, okay? Longitudinal or scalar electromagnetic signal is actually not a wave, but a point in a line. And it actually can propagate at multiples of the speed of light, of the waveform of light. So the waveform of light is what we call the speed of light, but there's this other type. So that began to be studied also in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, began to be weaponized into systems, and by 1947 or so, they began to have, and I use this word cautiously, successful deployments of it so that it would hit an interstellar vehicle, interfere with its electronics, and have it crash. Now, I know men personally who have operated those systems up to and including recently in the last few years at facilities at various places around the globe. So when you begin to hear that beginning from the 40s until not that long ago, there were multiple crash retrievals of these objects. It wasn't because these interstellar civilizations who they're running around with IQs of 400 to 600. So I'm like a Down syndrome child, and but they're very advanced. They were running into the deployment of these systems, and they were based all over, and they began to be based all over the planet. And by the 1960s, they had successfully propagated those around the globe in enough locations covertly that they could track and target an extraterrestrial vehicle, hit it, and have it become disabled. Now, obviously not every ET object that appears has that happen, so it's not like it happens every nanosecond, but it has happened dozens and perhaps hundreds of times. I met with an officer in the Air Force, in the Army, who was at Fort Huachuca out here in Arizona, Army Intelligence Headquarters, who had been in an underground facility in the 70s where there were 9 extraterrestrial vehicles and autopsied bodies that were in storage there. So, and that's just one facility, and that was 40 some years ago. Fort Huachuca. It's near Tombstone, ironically, Arizona. So these facilities began to be developed that are all underground, and they were studying the extraterrestrial material. That operation was very separate from the conventional, let's call it, extraordinary anti-gravity research going on in other operations. There are very few points of contact. So this is where you get into a complex understanding of TSSCI, Top Secret Special Compartmented Information or Intelligence. And the compartmentalization is very, very specific. And there could be people working on, say, gravity control systems for the Lockheed Skunk Works, but they weren't allowed to talk to and didn't know anything about the people studying the extraterrestrial materials, but there would be a few points of contact that would bridge it over. All right, but very few, very tightly compartmented. That's how that is structured. And I have had the privilege of interviewing people who've worked on both sides. Now, when you begin to consider then, we've had over 60 years, 62 years, and trillions of dollars in black budget unacknowledged special access funding, USAP, unacknowledged special access, completely black, funding of this kind of research and development, both on extraterrestrial material and on other conventional, and the then augmentation of the conventional anti-gravity human with the extraterrestrial studied material, you can begin to realize that what's out there that humans control is fearsome and awesome. And unfortunately, to the lay person or to the average general, admiral, or president, is indistinguishable from an extraterrestrial object in their mind. So that is really the danger point. That is where you have the risk of you being able to take these objects that are 100% man-made and, for example, this boomerang flying object seen through around the Hudson Valley, I believe this one, and the Hudson Valley events and the reported up and down, I think it was 88, something like that. And people got right up underneath it. Look what's underneath. Can you see that? Little tubes and structures and grids and what have you. That's not extraterrestrial. That's man-made. Probably out of the Boeing Phantom Works out of Seattle. And they were just seeing what the public would do. So people were stopped on the freeway reporting it. Tens of thousands of people saw these. Silent. A little bit of a humming sound, like a transformer. 100% man-made. 100% fooled everyone looking at it. Thought it was E.T. This is what I'm saying. The false flag's already happened. But they've been beta testing the system with these kinds of events. Another one that was reported are the big flying triangles, 200-300 feet across. Remember these? Belgium, other places. Look underneath. So these have been reported, and they have a grid structure, very manufactured, very man-made. Silent, except for a little bit of a humming sound when you're close. Electromagnetogravitics, floats along. Now, here's another layer of confusion that I didn't get a chance to share this with Mr. Schrad. There are extraterrestrial objects that look like and approximate the man-made ones. Now, you want to get a little more confused. Consider that if there's an extraterrestrial event that happens, they will then put up a man-made one, and they'll hoax a man-made event piggybacking on an extraterrestrial one, just to really confuse the picture. And that's happened many, many times. And there's a plethora of these that are very strange looking. This is another one. You see the structure? It's reported in a case. Now, Mr. Schrad has collected the best eyewitness documents of these at close range from people and then done models and drawings and what have you, and they're excellent. And these are all man-made. Now, to anyone who would casually see this, and then objects that were very similar to what was seen in the Phoenix Lights, these sort of objects. You know, a fraction of a mile across. Also, can be, not always are, can be human man-made ones. If I'm confusing you, I apologize. But I think the nuance of this can't be lost anymore. We can't be simplistic and, frankly, stupid. And that's why when you have these wonderful, renditions that he's done. Here's another one I showed earlier. And this one. And this is a wonderful. You can zoom in on this one because someone got up close enough to this to see the structure under this anti-gravity system. Man-made also. So there's an entire history of aerospace research and development that's now 62 years on, using technologies that are having to do with mass cancellation, anti-gravity. And those have been deployed purposely so that it'll get into the media and thousands of people will see it, and it will either hide an extraterrestrial event and overwhelm it, or it will simply be a way of them testing the system to see what will the people say, what will the media say, how are they going to react, and then they can refine their algorithm, their protocol for how to do the hoax down the road. This is how they refine the false flag over a 60-year period. Now, one of the people who you all have heard of, I'm sure, who was the Lockheed Skunk Works head for years until he passed away, is Ben Rich. And, you know, I have people who were at meetings with him where he confirmed that we had things that could, quote, take ET home. And he also acknowledged that every point in space and time is connected to every other one through consciousness, and that telepathy, as it's commonly called, is real, etc. But Ben Rich may not have had all full access up to that level. And in some letters that we have, courtesy of Mr. Schratt, and these are, I just laid eyes on these today. I have a letter, Lockheed Advanced Aeronautics, to a gentleman, Mr. John Andrews. He says, and the first letter that was written to him was, do you think that the UFOs are real, and et cetera, and so on. And he says, in response to your letter, I am a believer. So is Kelly Johnson, who of course, with the U-2 spy plane. With regards to another gentleman's comment, I do not believe any Lockheed person could or would have made that commitment. Rest easy. Anyway, and it's signed Ben Rich, July 8, 1986. And so in this, the letter, he asked for a clarification. And he says, did you mean UFOs as in man-made or extraterrestrial? And Ben Rich, the head of the very famous Lockheed Skunk Works, says, Dear John, this is the July 21st, 1986. Yes, I'm a believer in both categories. I feel everything is possible. Many of our man-made UFOs are unfunded opportunities. He underlined UFO, and unfunded opportunities. In both categories, there are lots of kooks and charlatans, so be careful. Best regards, Ben Rich. Here it is. Explosive, dispositive. Now, he, again, would not have had a complete all-access pass into every compartment, extraterrestrial and man-made, because the intelligence officer that we have recently interviewed confirmed that the area at Nellis Air Force Base that dealt with man-made advanced UFO-type anti-gravity was completely separate from and hermetically sealed from the extraterrestrial facility underground that was run by people, not ETs, but that had the ET craft they were studying. We've also had it confirmed that the very famous Cash Landrum case, how many people have heard of this? In the early 80s, and there was a craft outside Houston that had a core breach and was spewing radioactive material and injured and killed a couple of women. And looked like a saucer, and it was flying, and they had to call in helicopters to assist, and it made a crash landing in a remote area. This Air Force Office of Special Investigations official on camera admits that he was the principal investigator that for the Air Force put out the cover story that it was a UFO, and he said it was one of ours, but the skin of the craft, the shell, was extraterrestrial. The power plant, which they had not been able to fully figure out, had a hybrid system that had a nuclear power component that had a filtering problem and a core breach and began to spew radioactivity on people. And this is on camera. This is a lieutenant colonel, name, rank, serial number. I'm telling you, this is going to be explosive, this movie, Unacknowledged. So what you need to understand is that the intelligence community is thrilled if the UFO community says, it was a UFO, it was all alien. When in reality, it's not that simple. It's both. Some of it's ET, some of it's man-made. Some of it's both. And the Cash Landrum crash case was both. So this understanding is key. Otherwise, everyone's going to assume anything that we don't understand that zips around is extraterrestrial. Moreover, anything that would come over and do an Independence Day attack, boom, is extraterrestrial, when it isn't. It is not. It is absolutely not. It's all a lie. It's the biggest hoax in human history, and you've got to wake up to this. So, and I think that one of the problems that we have is, and I remember in 1994, that time period, it was a devastating time for me. I was going to quit all this. It's too difficult. A man came to me and says, yes, you've discovered the truth. But guess what? No one's going to believe you. He says the truth is so much more bizarre than the lie that it hides itself. And he says for that reason, you will be discredited even though you're speaking the truth. He says, so just be prepared that if you talk about this, you will be discredited. And I said, I understand that, but do you not warn the public of something like this? If we had known that we had hoaxed the Gulf of Tonkin, and could we have avoided Vietnam? If we had known about 9/11 in advance, or the hoaxing of the weapons of mass destruction materials about Iraq, could we have avoided that disaster? This is my dilemma. So, you know, if I speak the truth, I'm discredited and hated. If I don't speak the truth, I carry a heavy, heavy burden. So, you know, I'd rather speak the truth even if people hate it. Now, here's another object that's been seen. Very unusual, very detailed, excellent rendition that Mr. Schrad has done. Man-made, very advanced. I suspect would deceive almost everyone who saw it. And this is the Hudson Valley boomerang shape, probably out of the Boeing Phantom Works. And tens of thousands of people saw this, by the way. The ones who were close enough to it could see actually the structure and the girds and the struts and the infrastructure of the craft. Well, interstellar vehicles don't have that. So here's a little tip. The ET objects are seamless, have no parts like that, and have a completely different quality to them because they are interstellar and transdimensional. Because they go beyond the speed of light and they are manufactured in a way that is completely different. So listen very carefully because I'm going to blow your minds, if I haven't already. And I know this is a lot of information in an hour. But listen carefully. Your life will depend on it. And those folks in Washington and Moscow listening, listen very carefully. Interstellar vehicles do not manufacture the way we do. So like if you're going to make one of these, you're going to dig up the materials, put it through a mold, rivet it together, have plates and struts and parts, right? But it's got a power plant on it that's electromagnetic-gravitic, mass cancellation, it floats, it's silent, looks and sounds like a UFO, and it could be a saucer, it could be any shape. They can make them in any shape. An interstellar vehicle is not manufactured that way. So I don't want to lose everyone with a lot of jargon here, but if you can for a moment, you've heard of 3D printing? Imagine if you did 3D printing, but from another dimension. Think about that for just a minute. So that you, if you had mastered 0-point energy, the base energy field that all matter and energy is fluxing from, all subatomic particles, and you had mastered it in such a way that you could create a resonant frequency in the shape of a spacecraft. And it would then go from that fourth, fifth dimensional energy field into 3D as almost an extrusion mold. Does this make sense? And where it would materialize in that perfect form. It wasn't something that was put together by digging up those minerals, melting them, smelting them, and riveting them together. This is why they do not have those kind of moving parts and seams. They are seamless. Very important data point for those of you who will have a close encounter with a man-made object versus a close encounter with an extraterrestrial object. I'm trying to give you a little tutorial here. And I'll take it one step further. When they have retrieved extraterrestrial objects and they've done the assays, the metallurgical studies and atomic studies, the material is so pure that even in the vacuum of space, we could not create it with any known human technologies because it's being created transdimensionally using these sort of electronic fields that cause matter to be aggregated, if you will, out of thin air, out of space. Because everything, space is not empty. The majority of the cosmos, black energy, black, dark matter, et cetera, and so on, you can aggregate the subatomic, atomic, and molecular structure for any element, or any matter, or any complex molecule, and materialize it. Does this make sense? It is a known science in the very high end of the intelligence community. Now we're talking about something which the guys I know at the CIA call WSFM, weird science and frickin' magic. And that is what they call it. Now, my uncle worked for Northrop Grumman on the lunar module, landed on the moon, and I talked to an engineer there not long ago, and he said, yes, we just call it PFM. And excuse my language, pure fucking magic. And he says that's what they call it. He was an aerospace engineer. And so when you begin to deal with these sort of very advanced technologies, there are grades of it. So there's man-made anti-grav, there's man-made anti-gravity systems that have been hybridized studying extraterrestrial materials, the notch up. Then you have the purely extraterrestrial objects, which are a quantum leap beyond. Now, since Ben Rich died in 1995, and he made those comments, in the last 21 years, trillions of dollars have been spent on this, and some of the most brilliant minds in the world have worked on it. And some of these gentlemen I know, scientists, and they've worked in the Cube, as it's called, up there at the Skunk Works underground, not far from Palmdale. And in the Cube, they've done things that are now transdimensional. So now they have the ability to hoax events that really, even more so, look extraterrestrial, but are man-made. Very dangerous business. Now, this is why the president-elect and the Congress and the National Military Command Center and the director of the CIA and the Secretary of Defense and the generals on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, most of whom will never be read into what I'm sharing, need to know this. They have a need to know. And so do you, the public, so you're not fooled. Don't be fooled again. And Mr. Putin needs to know this, because there is a group that has malice aforethought and has planned to launch these assets in a way that would look like 100% like an attack on our planet or on human assets, calling it alien when it's being run by people. I call it the Wizard of Oz. So you have these guys, it's like the Wizard of Oz, remember at the end, they pull the curtain back and there's this old crudmudgeon pulling all the levers, scaring the hell out of Dorothy. And this is I call it the Wizard of Oz effect. But it's very sophisticated. and we should not underestimate their capacity. Back some years ago, I hosted in Washington, prior to the National Press Club event in 2001, a private briefing for Congress that was at the Westin Hotel in Georgetown. And there were a number of people there and chairmen of committees. And Edgar Mitchell was there as my guest. He's passed on now. And one of the gentlemen who was there was a man who had been on an interagency committee in 1974. Now this is 42 years ago. And the testimony he was going to provide to those members of Congress and other people, there was a science advisor for Vice President Al Gore there, all kinds of folks, was that we had this capability I'm telling you about today in November of 2016, and that all they would have to do is push a button, boom, and the entire event would roll out. And he said everyone on planet Earth would be fooled. Now, if I had heard that only from one person, I would have discounted it as madness. I've heard it from one person after another, after another, after another, after another, on a granular level. And now we have an Air Force Office of Special Investigations counterintelligence officer confirming the false flag operations. But he would not discuss, he says, that's still very secret, that's very secret, I can't talk about that. We have it on camera jumping out of his skin because I asked the question in a way that he understood. Do you know about the deceptive INWs and the false INWs? No one else running the cameras knew what that term meant. He did. This is in the film. Now, what happens then when you have a black operation that is so secretive that they could pull off a stunt like this? It means they could stampede the entire world into an Independence Day, like the movie, event. Has this already been beta tested? Yes. So they beta tested and have been testing on the public sightings that are man-made UFOs, often piggybacking on sightings of actual ET craft so that people are confused, don't have any discernment. They've also been involved in using first the stagecraft of little people, and I mean no offense to short people. I know sometimes people get prickly when I talk about this because I'm 6'4", but special operations folks who are under 5 feet and with certain makeup and masks on these anti-gravities who would go then and abduct people. So there have been abduction squads, which are also confirmed by this Air Force intelligence officer, that have been operative for decades. And when it has suited the intelligence community, they have engaged in human abductions that 100% fool those poor victims who really think they were abducted by an ET. And they weren't, but it sure looks like it. Now there are two modalities used here. The aircraft itself, which is an anti-grav. The stagecraft initially were special operations personnel who now they have robotic ones that look actually like certain species of ETs, extraterrestrial biological entities, in the EBINs. But they're man-made. I know several people who worked on making these creatures, and they've been called programmed life forms. But they have integrated circuits in their neural complex. They're 100% man-made. But they would absolutely fool 99.999999 to out to 100 decimal points. Anyone in the public that it was extraterrestrial. Those are fully operational, have been for decades. The early ones were these more clumsy attempts. It's also done in association with electromagnetic weapon systems that alter awareness, can make you black out, and also certain chemicals, drugs, canisters that'll be thrown and the person will then pass out, have no memory of what happened, and then awaken with this other event happen, having been abducted by an extraterrestrial. A lot of people have said, oh, Dr. Greer says no one's ever been abducted. I said, yeah, they have. and they attempted to abduct me out of my hotel room at the St. Moritz Hotel in July of 1994 when I met with Prince Hans Adam von Liechtenstein. So I'm one of those victims. I know what they're capable of. The difference with me is that I knew what it was. Now this gets more complex, and we haven't scratched the surface, and I don't know how disturbed you are yet, but it's going to get worse. Take a deep breath. So in 1989, there was a guy named Mikhail Gorbachev, who was head of the Soviet Union, and then during that period of the Bush era, President Bush, George H.W. Bush, not W, but George H.W., elder, who had been CIA director. And he was a mid-level person on this MAGIC committee, Majority Intelligence Committee, or Majestic. And he and Gorbachev and Peres de Cuellar, who is the Secretary General of the United Nations, and others were planning to disclose that we weren't alone in an event, a disclosure event. In November of 1989, Peres de Cuellar was abducted out of his motorcade at about 3 a.m. in New York City by aliens. Now, I put in parentheses aliens, meaning human assets. And he was taken and on board this human-controlled abduction event and told that if he were to continue with that plan, that the aliens would abduct everyone involved, including the President of the United States. And Prince Hans Adam von Liechtenstein told me this personally because he was personal friends with Peres de Cuellar, the UN Secretary General. And the Crown Prince of Liechtenstein said to me, "This is why I don't believe you'll be successful at disclosing the extraterrestrial presence." And I just smiled and I said, "Well, I believe you have it backwards." And he did not know, this was in July of 1994, of the ability of the intelligence community to set up a hoax of someone like a world figure, political figure like the head of the United Nations. That actually happened. Now, because of that, Gorbachev, Bush Sr., the president, Peres de Cuellar, and others involved canceled the plans to let the public know we weren't alone, because they were concerned that, and I was told, and I'm quoting by Prince Hans von Liechtenstein, that this blew up like an atomic bomb in the Bush White House, and they said, we're staying out of this now. And ever since then, no one in that office has wanted to deal with this, because they don't know what's ET and now what's human. And the stagecraft and the ability to interfere with plans by people who are congressmen or UN secretary generals or presidents is so great that none of them want to risk that happening to them. Because in those elite circles, trust me, because have been in meetings, those folks don't want that to happen to them. Or worse. This is why, you know, when I got this information to President Bill Clinton via his CIA director, 2 months or a month later, a very good friend of the Clinton family came to my home and said, well, they really support what you're recommending, but they're afraid that if President Clinton does this, he will end up like Jack Kennedy. And I laughed. I thought he was joking. And he says, what are you laughing at? I'm being serious. This guy was a jokester, sort of bag man for the Democratic Party, fundraiser. And I said, well, if that's true, we really are in trouble. Now that was in January 1994. And you can see why between December of 1993 and the summer of 1994, I was canceling my involvement in this subject. I had to be begged to stay in it, because this is very difficult. So this is how long I've known this. So I think that my problem personally, and I'm saying it as a man, one fallible human, is who do I share this with, and when, and with what detail? I'm only scratching the surface. And because of what has been happening with the WikiLeaks, with John Podesta's emails about UFOs, the New York Times reporting on Hillary's interest in it, which this was a red line subject, the mainstream media starting to report it, they are being unleashed. To me, there are signs out there that this false flag hoaxing of an attack on the planet is closer than it's been in 22 years that I've been involved. Now, the gentleman who had this story to tell and who was an official on the interagency committee dealing with this specifically, who was going to testify in front of these members of Congress at that private meeting I set up in 1997, he told me that this was the most difficult thing he'd ever done because he felt like he was betraying some of his brothers in the intelligence community, but he felt the world needed to know. That night, he was sequestered out of the Westin Hotel by people who he had worked with back in the 70s and taken to an undisclosed location out in Virginia, and he never returned, and we've never heard from him since. He left a note under my assistant's door, Sherry Adamak, saying that I have to leave. The people who I've worked with are begging me not to go forward with this testimony, and they are begging for time for them to get this under control and stand it down. Unfortunately, I do not think he succeeded. I think these rogue elements have prevailed since 1997. It's almost 20 years later. And for that reason, we are in mortal danger of being deceived by this. Now, am I saying that all people who have had contact with ETs have been abducted by humans? No. I'm saying, though, that if you have trillions of dollars and the kind of technologies I've been referring to, and you have the intent to masquerade and simulate an alien contact abduction event, you can do it. So that is one of the chief issues that we have to begin to think about. What part of what we hear about in the UFO and internet and movies and books is ET, interstellar? What part is counterintelligence and propaganda and conditioning events by the intelligence community and by the deep, 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 darkest parts of this rogue community that have betrayed the United States and every other country on earth? Well, I'm telling you that their stagecraft, as they call it, is so good that there are very few people who would not be deceived by it. Which means that we have to approach every account we hear, every event that happens, with extraordinary, scrupulous skepticism. And we are not being skeptical enough. Now, I know I'm building a very long bridge for you to go over, and I apologize for that. And it's not my fault that you've been lied to for 70 years. As I was preparing to come here, my sort of gut check on this is that what is the right thing for me to do? And that is to send up a call, like Paul Revere. The British are coming. Well, the British are fine now, but this is coming. And let's not get fooled again. Now, I want to talk about another level of this, and this is a more complex one than what I've shared. And that is the electromagnetic systems, human-controlled, that affect consciousness and the human experience. Back in 1994, I met a man who headed up a research and development effort in the 50s. And he had developed an electronic system so that you could put on a headset and alter anyone, not a trained psychic, but anyone, so that they could remote view through consciousness the field of mind any place on Earth. He offered this system to me as the director of CSETI, the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence, because our prime mission is to create a time of universal peace and open contact. And we use remote viewing, but we use the more innate capability, meditative faculties, as you probably know. And I said, no, I don't want that, because that's going to lend itself to being misused. And he says, you're very wise. It has been misused. So after he developed it, the CIA set up a front company, I believe he called it Alphametric Corporation, that bought this technology and then took it in subterranean and has been developing it ever since. So he said, you know, we developed this so well that we can target somebody with an electromagnetic field that has embedded in it like a script or a hologram or a series of experiences, like a lucid dream. And that person will believe it's real, and it'll be indistinguishable from reality. And I am quoting now from this senior scientist. He said, it is so good that if we want you to have a personal conversation with your personal God, Jesus, Muhammad, Buddha, whoever it is, you'll have it, you will think it's real, and you will absolutely pass a lie detector test that it happened. That's how good it is. Now that was fully operational in 1956, 60 years ago. So now you combine that with the conventional stuff like MK Ultra. Everybody know the song, Muse, the rock group did a song called MK Ultra. But the MK Ultra stands for mind control, K like German control. And it was acknowledged CIA program. It came out during the Senator Church hearings back some years ago in the 70s, I believe. And they were using, what they acknowledged through those hearings was they were using LSD and other things to do mind control. The part of it that did not get acknowledged in the church hearings on Capitol Hill is what I'm discussing now. That was kept secret. And that's the electromagnetic systems. Some people call these radionic and psychotronic systems that can affect consciousness. They can also affect biological systems. They can induce cancers. They can induce heart attacks. They can do a lot of nasty stuff with these weapons. And they have. So just you be aware that that level, this is now going into a deeper level of operational capability than, let's say, these anti-gravity craft. Because now you combine this with chemical hallucinogenic systems, electromagnetic mind-altering targeting systems, the stagecraft or program life forms, or small people who are made up to look like an ET, and boy, can you fool a lot of folks. So this that I'm talking about right now, I was pulled aside by someone and said, if you continue to talk about this, you are putting your life in peril. We're going to not tolerate it. Now that was in 1994 also, because this is the deepest part of the secrecy around this subject. Nobody wants to talk about it. No one wants to acknowledge it. If you do talk about it, they think you're wearing a tinfoil hat. And you know, you're going to get ridiculed, you're going to be debunked, and the UFO believers are going to hate you because they've bought into certain paradigms of us versus them and all this stuff that's in the pop culture and internet and movies and documentaries, and it's all a hoax. And the intelligence community is going to hate you. The public can't get their mind around it. It's a lose-lose-lose situation for a gentleman like myself. And, but I still feel compelled that you need to know the truth. A few people need to hear this who can be prime movers and help us. We're running out of time. And I think that this is why when I first got involved with this, I was early on, and I want to set the record straight on this, invited out to Lawrence Rockefeller's ranch out in the Tetons. And unfortunately, people call this the Rockefeller Initiative and this and that. what it was, and you can look this up online, it was Project Starlight. And Project Starlight I started in 1993 to put together people who would be whistleblowers and military witnesses and put the best available evidence together to get to the President and members of Congress to let them know about this. Now, Lawrence Rockefeller and I had a very private discussion on his deck that one of the nights we were all gathered out there. And I asked him, I said we need someone like you to lead this up. I have 4 young children and I'm full-time in an emergency department taking care of life and death things 60, 80 hours a week. I really don't have time to do this. And he said, no, I won't do it. You have to do it. And I said, are you out of your mind? I'm a country doctor in North Carolina, rambling around in an ER. And I said, this is not something I should be doing. You're a Rockefeller. And I literally said, look, Lawrence, you're old, you're rich, and you're a Rockefeller. Just like that. And I'm very blunt. And one of my uncharming aspects, I'm very direct. But he said, no, my family, referring to David Rockefeller, his brother, who was head of Chase Manhattan Bank, who's part of this cabal, and his nephew, Jay Rockefeller, who was chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, also a member of the cabal, are jumping up and down on my nuts. And I'll just say that's what he said. Now, other times I've said my toes, but that's what he said. And I said, well, you know, I'm sorry about that, but blood's thicker than water. And he wouldn't do it. So he's played a support role, and we began to organize this effort. And in 1995, we had the Asilomar gatherings near Monterey, where we had KGB people, cosmonauts, military witnesses come together. We signed, many of us, not everyone, the Project Starlight document that went to the President. The Associated Press sued. It got released. It's on the website. Go see it. This is all a matter of public record. But what Lawrence Rockefeller said to me is that not only was his family upset, but it was too dangerous for him to do. And he begged me to just go ahead and do it. And with his hands, he made interestingly, a shape like this. Like this object. And he made like this, and he said, it's like a flock of geese flying along. And I want to be back here. You know, and I'll be back here. We need someone up here. I said, yes, but geese, when they do this, they take turns rotating because because they're taking the headwind. And he laughed. He says, well, too bad. So that, you know, the rest is sort of, as they say, history. But in these sort of corridors, there are a lot of very good people who really do want to see this resolved, but they don't know what to do about it. And I've concluded it cannot be resolved by these elites. It's got to be resolved by us. We've got to get educated about this. We need more whistleblowers to step forward confirming this information, like this Air Force intelligence officer who did an astonishing 3.5-hour interview. Now, only a few minutes of it can be in this 2-hour documentary that's coming out. So I'm going to, after that comes out, we're going to put the entire interview out for people to see. The entirety of it. Be stunning, shocking. But at the same time, we need to understand that if we can put out a warning call, all of you listening, to our friends, our neighbors, we can perhaps avert this disaster. And because putting the sunshine on this and exposing it neutralizes the threat. There's no element of surprise if we come out with information, and more people do, like Mr. Schratt, showing what these aircraft that men are making at the Skunk Works and at Northrop and at Boeing are, and what their capabilities are. But we also need more people like these whistleblowers. Now, there's a whole group of people. I'm not going to go through all this. I'm going to hold up a few of them who are part of a group who have been exposing the electronic warfare systems. You know, here we have an NSA veteran, Naval Academy graduate, a practicing physician who is targeted with these weapons, a whistleblower from DARPA, U.S. Army officer in physics, a whole group of people I have here who have come forward with these electromagnetic weapon systems and how innocent people have been victimized, targeted by them. And being one of those people, and I've been someone who has been targeted with these systems, I can tell you that if you know they exist, you won't be fooled by them. If you don't know they exist, you will. This is why, in the Vedas it says knowledge is the greatest purifier. If we have knowledge, then we can discern. If we have no knowledge and no information and we're in the dark, we can be deceived. And this is also why Lieutenant Colonel Tom Bearden put out years ago this book called The Real Star Wars. And Tony Craddock, my friend, just released it. I wrote the foreword to it. I had a copy of it here somewhere. And it's about these electromagnetic, radionic, and psychotronic systems. And this was released in the 80s. It's a little monograph this big. And Lieutenant Colonel Bearden knew about this. And so he began to talk about it. Now, so he could talk about it and not get in trouble, he always referred to it as Soviet technology. That was just a ruse. He had to. He had to, because he had very top secret clearances. But this information's been out for decades, but it's sort of hidden in plain sight. What I want to do is connect these dots to folks so that you understand that, yes, there are extraterrestrial civilizations. They're very concerned with what's happening on this planet. And yes, there are humans that have these assets that mimic and have reached, and I'm going to use this word carefully, parity, near equivalence with what an appearance would be of an extraterrestrial vehicle, because they have become more and more and more refined over the decades, up to and including very powerful electromagnetic systems that are transdimensional, can materialize things, if you go to Dugway Proving Grounds near Salt Lake City, near Provo, there are things going on there that look 100% ET, but they're not extraterrestrial, they're alien. They're man-made. But it's incredibly well-defined, well-developed. With that knowledge, maybe we will have discernment. And with that knowledge and discernment, maybe we won't be fooled again. This is my hope and my prayer. And if we don't get discernment, we're going to be sitting ducks, much more so than we were on 9/11. And I think that this is why, in my opinion, we have all have the responsibility to share this seminar and this information with the public, with everyone we know, as far-fetched as it may seem. Now, one of the things that I've wondered in my own mind is to what extent there have been people who are embedded in our society, who have had these scripted experiences and are sharing information that they believe to be true, but that have been completely scripted. Now, this is going to be very difficult for me to talk about. I don't like talking about personalities. You'll find that in the history of my entire career, I talk about issues and information and not people. But with that said, I want to talk about a gentleman who I knew quite well, who's passed away, named Dr. Fred Bell. Anybody ever heard of him? A few people. Interesting character. So Dr. Bell, the name sound familiar? Bell, Alexander Graham Bell, descendant of Alexander Graham Bell. And he, in the disclosure material, is one of the only a couple people who aren't named name, rank, and serial number. And I will tell you now, first time I've ever shared this, why he's not named. He shared information very important, but I had to be very careful of what I included. Now, this gets into the sort of unique responsibility I have in this regard. And he had been given over to the MK Ultra program at the agency at birth, as a very, literally at birth, to the intelligence community, to be programmed as sort of a genius in aerospace and technology, and to work inside the system as sort of a electronically, psychotronically controlled slave. Now, that's how I would put it. Now, his parents did this with knowledge of forethought. How anyone can do this to a child, I don't know. But he was. And I was at his home and saw his badges from Hughes aircraft, from the anti-gravity chamber that Hughes had, from all the different contractors and things he had worked on. And he had gotten, and actually had met Werner von Braun also. And his specialty, what they had trained him to do, was to develop weapon systems that would target, hit, and knock down extraterrestrial vehicles when they came out of trans-dimensional space-time into 3D. Now, I don't want to get too techie here again, but when you're going from the Andromeda galaxy, 2.5 million light years from here, to Earth, you're not going at the speed of light. It'd take you 2.5 million years to get here. That's what a light year is. It's the distance light goes in a year. So it'd take you 5 million years to go back and forth at the speed of light. Never mind the space shuttle or some piece of junk like the rockets and jets. So if you are an interstellar civilization, you are by definition trans-dimensional, because you're going to go through the crossing point of light, you're going to cross into these other dimensions, and then in point A and point B, 2.5 million light years distance, Andromeda galaxy, Earth, then is here, because you're bypassing linear space-time. Does it make sense? And you can do this through teleportation resonance systems. Anyway, so, which, by the way, we started experimenting also with in the 50s and were able to perfect. In fact, even before then, the so-called Philadelphia experiment, which didn't happen in Philadelphia, is another long story, I won't get into the weeds here, was in the 40s. So these electronics were being experimented with humans, but interstellar civilizations perfected this many, many, many millions of years ago. Some of them are certainly hundreds of thousands of years ago. Now what that means is that as they then come into near Earth or materialize in our solar system, at that point they're trackable in the Deep Space Network, out of NORAD and other facilities, and Alpha satellites. As they approach Earth, then they can be targeted with these electronic scalar systems and hit. And that's what's been going on for over 70 years. This is an existential threat to Earth. Now, I have personal, detailed knowledge, and so did Dr. Bell. He admitted he was involved not only in developing the technologies, but present when they were being used, actuated, and would go out and witness them. Boom, one would hit an ET craft, drop straight into the Pacific Ocean. 1965. 51 years ago. So the fact that this has been going on for 70 years or more since Roswell, and there has not been a serious pushback, an overt pushback by these interstellar civilizations, is remarkable. I doubt we would have behaved similarly. And this is why I say to people, I think you should be much less concerned about the extraterrestrial civilizations than the human. And if you want to know where the problem is, go find a mirror and look in it right now. But Dr. Bell, when he was discussing this, also would then tell me about these electronic systems that he was put through in MK Ultra, where he had experiences that were trans-dimensional in consciousness, he thought were real, with beings and civilizations that were horrific, horrible. And that's how they taught him to hate the aliens. So whenever he would, that's how they got him to be enthusiastic about the science, because he had these experiences with these aliens. It was all a scripted psychotronic hologram. And he would then say, like Will Smith in Independence, let's go kick alien butt. And he'd go out there, and when they would hit one of these ET craft and it would fall down, he would just jump up and down with joy. We killed another one of the bastards. And I'd sit in his home as he related these things and went, whoa, boy, this is very dangerous stuff. You're dealing with civilizations that have been visiting us on Earth for, dare I say, millions of years. Ancient aliens, anyone? But yes, I mean, we've never been alone. And suddenly we're doing atomic weapons and the nuclear weapons and these scalar weapons and all this other stuff. And they have not pushed back yet. What does that say? It's almost a Gandhi-esque restraint. You know, when Gandhi was shot by the guy who assassinated him, he turned and blessed them and fell. The last thing he did was bless the person in a Christ-like act of forgiveness. So, you know, if they were so horrific, we would have known about it about 1945. It had been all over, point, set, match, finished. Now, when I was at the Vatican having a theological conversation about this was Monsignor Balducci, that was facilitated by my very good friend Paula Harris, who's an angel in this field. And Monsignor Balducci was a senior theologian, actually a demonologist for the Pope, Pope John Paul. And we were talking about this. He says, oh, it's so ridiculous. He says, we all know, of course, if they were a threat, it'd all be over. And he said, and I love it, with classic Italian flourish, very tall patrician figure, I think taller than I am. And he said, lower than humanity, there cannot exist in the universe. It was hilarious. I was in his apartment overlooking the Vatican. And it was a very interesting perspective from this senior theologian. Now, he did say that, however, there's an attempt to confuse people with things from other dimensions that are like demons or even angels with ETs. But he says, you know what? Angels, and by inference, demons, don't need flying saucers. But people, because of the strangeness of how an interstellar civilization going through dimensions can appear, people will conflate them or confuse them with either a demon or an angel. Guess what? The intelligence community loves that you're confused. And they put things out to further confuse you. To wit, mutilations. Okay, there's a man, Denver, very eminent medical doctor, fellow physician, hematologist, oncologist named Dr. John Altshuler. His uncle was the great General Jimmy Doolittle of World War II, who was sent over to the European theater during World War II by FDR to look into Foo Fighters. Yes, it's a rock group. Hello, Dave Grohl. But it was originally the object seen in World War II that the Nazis thought was a secret U.S. Allied weapon. We thought was a secret Nazi weapon. General Doolittle went over there, investigated it, and they were these trans-dimensional objects, spheres, balls of energy that would go around our aircraft, go down the center aisle of the planes, right between the men, out the other side, and this and that. And he came back and reported to FDR, and this is during World War II, that, and I'm quoting, he said, sir, those are interplanetary vehicles. So that's how far back this goes, and how far back it's been studied very seriously. And so Dr. John Altshuler had a knowledge of this, deep knowledge of this, from his uncle, who was this general. He then lived in Colorado where Snippy the horse, y'all remember Snippy the horse? The first so-called cattle mutilation was a cattle that was a horse. He was called out because he was a pathologist, hematologist, pathologist, and he was interested in this. So he went out, began to study this in great detail, concluded they were all being done by counterintelligence operations using extraordinary technologies that are all human, staging it to look alien for its fear factor and its psychological warfare value. When did he conclude that? Oh, long before An Alien Harvest was written by Linda Moulton Howe. And this is known in UFO circles. Now the question becomes, and this is a very big problem, what would compel someone to continue to report out to the public things that are extraterrestrial when it was established by the only true medical doctor and scientist in the field decades ago that it was a hoaxed, staged, false flag, supportive, in other words, an event supporting the false flag directive from the 50s. I told you this would be very bad news for all of you and your belief systems. I do not apologize in a way because I think it's unfortunate. What's unfortunate is that the great heroes like Dr. Altshuler, who's passed away, who had knowledge and spoke of this, and a couple people in this room I think probably knew him, were run amok of and trampled underfoot. And the sensationalism of fear and the sensationalism of the evil aliens are here to eat us for lunch, and now are they eating us for lunch and abducting us or mutilating us on top of it. Well, guess what? It's all a lie, a hoax. Now, there are certainly people who have had horrific experiences and terrible things done to them. And I've had some things myself like this. But, and they are excused for not knowing whether it's extraterrestrial or man-made, because who would know this? But at the same time, there are people who should know this or have known it who have covered it up. And this we cannot allow any further. This has got to be called out. The other problem is when you have people like Dr. Bell who have been having these experiences, we have to understand that there are some very, very good people out there speaking about information, experiences they've had that they do believe to be extraterrestrial. That, in fact, and I'm thinking now of a man I haven't met, but who is a wonderful gentleman from all accounts, a guy named Corey Good, and who's doing the Full Disclosure Project, and he and I are like hand in glove, supportive of many things, but some of the things he's recounting about slave trade and slave planets and things of this that he experienced because he was, as a 6 or 7 year old, I understand, taken into the military abduction program, like Dr. Bell. And I have no doubt he believed that those events were extraterrestrial. But I think that what I want people to understand is we have to be very careful about our assessment of what's out there in the universe based on people who have been in these programs who are, and I know that there was an executive at Gaia TV who was furious that I used this word, but who have been victims of this. And I don't think it's wrong to say if you're a 6 or 7 year old child and you're taken into a military abduction program and have stuff done to you, you've been a victim. I know that there are other people. I know Dr. Bell was a victim. Now, this is not to say that the person is a bad person or a wrong person. It's just to say that we have to look at what is being shared and understand that there could be information that is accurate, information that might have been scripted, information and experiences that have been had that have been programmable. So the holographic psychotronic systems that have been in existence since the 50s would allow for people, and have allowed for people, to have experiences that they 100% believe. Just as the man told me, people would believe that they were, if they had a conversation with their personal God, they'd pass a lie detector. They are sincere about what they're reporting. There is no, I'm not saying any deceit is in play. What I'm saying is that it would be very easy to deceive somebody who's a child or a young adult with these fearsome weapon systems and technologies that are in the hands of absolute psychopaths. I mean, true psychopaths in the covert programs. And I know who some of these folks are, and they will stop at nothing to see that people are convinced that there is a threat as Ronald Reagan said at the United Nations, that we should unite against and fight, to unite the world around. And all I have to say is that if the future is that future, you might as well dig a hole and climb in it. So we better wake up and understand that the information that is out there has to get looked at from many perspectives. What's the origin of the experience? Was it deep, unacknowledged special access projects that hoaxed it? Is that person having an experience with an extraterrestrial, interstellar civilization, an entity from another dimension that's not extraterrestrial, which is also out there? A scripted program from the intelligence community using these very advanced technologies that have been in development for 70 or 80 years? What is it? And it's not, I'm not trying, you have to ask these questions. And you have to begin to understand that there is a capacity to use this sort of information in a way that would redound to whom? The military, industrial, gangbangster, global complex of fascists that are desperate to have World War III be interplanetary. Now, this is why when you start talking about this issue of false INW, indications and warnings, deceptive indication and warnings, false flag, it's a very deep hole to go down. And what I would encourage people to do is to question what part of this, what they are learning, seeing, has been programmed into our society, and many times innocently has been piggybacked on people. One more level of what I call this, so I've gone through the aircraft that are anti-gravity, the electromagnetic weapon systems, and now the human intelligence. There are a lot of people who have had actual ET contact experiences that when that is known by the intelligence community, and I've had this confirmed to be by multiple independent corroborating sources, are then targeted by the intelligence community with a man-made abduction event to confuse them. And so that they don't know what part, where did the ET event end and the man-made one start. Do you understand what I'm saying? That has been done because everything is tracked. Everything is tracked. When these events happen that are ET, the intelligence community absolutely knows it's happened anywhere on the planet, and they can come in with a special operations team and then victimize that person who's had contact with an ET with a man-made, hoaxed alien encounter. So it gets very complex, and I regret to inform you that this is not something that is new. It's been talked about actually since the 70s and 80s by various people, but it's been hushed up. Hushed up by the UFO subculture, hushed up by the intelligence community. And the reason for it is that people don't want their paradigms changed. I think a lot of it is people don't want their belief systems challenged. And this gets into the last part of what I want to share before we take a break, which I'm sure you all need by now. And that is, let's look at the roots of human conflict. If you go back thousands of years, there is a connection that we have, millions of years, with other primates. We're 98% identical to chimpanzees and gorillas. And it's been found that chimpanzees and other monkeys do organize into troops that fight each other based on territory, based on differences, based on otherness, even if they look a little different. What are the roots of racism? What are the roots of homophobia? What's the roots of ethnic conflict? Why is this? This is the real original sin of Homo sapiens, of humans. Why do we view anything that is other than us as a threat? Well, there is some biological evolutionary specialists have said, well, this was done because there was an evolutionary advantage to groups that were forming socially to be able to dominate a territory, what have you, and another one would be a threat, so they'd get into fights and war them off, and it's very territorial. But now that we're in a civilization with thermonuclear weapons and anti-gravity and electromagnetic weapons and scalar weapons and all this, we have to have a spiritual awakening, in my opinion, where we realize that we can transcend all these isms. And I want to add another ism, alienism. Alienism, as I'm going to define it tonight, is the proclivity to view anything that is non-human, but an intelligent life form, as a potential threat. And the threat is directly proportional to how different they either appear or behave from us. This is rooted in thousands of years of human experience, where one tribe would attack and rape another, one ethnicity, one religion. So whether it's homophobia, Islamophobia, religious, ethnic, racist tendencies, these have a root that go back thousands of years in human experience. And they have found that when you develop a behavior like that, epigenetically, it is passed on within a generation or two, not thousands of years. But it means, this is the good news, you can reverse it in a generation or two. We can reverse racism. We can reverse alienism. We can reverse all of these things that have divided us into warring factions. And guess what? We have to. It is a requirement of our survival. We can no longer live as a species that views anything that we don't understand or is different from us as a priori immediately a threat and get into a fight with them. Whether it is another race, another gender, another sexual orientation, another ethnicity, or another species from another planet. Because that only ends in destruction. Now, when we were just clubbing each over the head with, clubs and spears and stuff, or muskets even, it was one thing to behave this way. It was deleterious and appalling and savage. To do it with thermonuclear weapons and these other classified weapons, and then to start bamming around out in space with this consciousness of alienism and division, is fraught and very risky. So I would say that, we shall overcome this. We must overcome it. It is in our collective experience as humans, but we can also overcome it through the force of our intellect, through spiritual development, and through the realization that within the field of conscious intelligence, there's a singularity of mind, and that all life in the universe and all intelligent life is awake through that same spirit. Doesn't matter who they are, where they are. And if we view ourselves and these other civilizations with the understanding of what the conscious mind is as an omnipresent field that is non-local, that there is a singularity of consciousness in mind. As Erwin Schrödinger said, the total number of minds in the universe is one. This is the father of modern quantum physics. And we begin to experience that in our meditation, our prayers, and our spiritual consideration. And this is why I think the crisis we're in, as complex as all this is, I've tried to go through a quick trip in 2 hours. The solution is, well, not simplistic, simple. It is spiritual. It's a spiritual development, not necessarily religious. I mean, I sort of make a distinction. Sometimes there's an inverse relationship between religiosity and spirituality. That's Greer's theorem. But not to say that not all religious people are not spiritual, but I'm just saying that if you're a fanatic religiously, you tend to not be very spiritual. And it becomes divisive. I mean, how many wars are we fighting over religious differences, which when you boil it down is ridiculous. So I think that we have to go deeper than that. But if we're now having to deal with interstellar civilizations that are waiting for us to join the interstellar club and the interstellar society, which is what's been happening for many decades, we're going to have to find a solution to this thinking, this paradigm of division, of racism and alienism, that the intelligence community, the bad actors here, not the good guys, but the bad actors have been exploiting because they know there is a history of people hating and fearing and fighting anyone that is different from them, whether it's a different sexual orientation and bashing gay people, or a different race with slavery, or a different gender and the suppression of women, or a different religion, on and on and on. And they know that they can exploit that. And they have been exploiting it. And we have to stand up and wake up and say, no more. We won't be fooled again. It is time for us to say, we're going to start living differently. We're going to have a civilization that is peaceful, that has free zero-point energy, that is just, and that is living in complete peace with itself and with others. And we are not going to go into space with weapon systems. We are not going to go into space looking for another alienism, another group to fight. And that if someone tries to stage an event, we're all going to call it out as the hoax that it is, and not go along with that, what I'm calling scripted Armageddon. They would love to see a shutdown of our civilization and the extermination of about 5 billion people through a conflict that they will stage. And they will manufacture Armageddon. And that's the big, deep plan that has been in place since the 50s. Those people in the intelligence community who know of this, I can't even put in words the extent to which they are devastated when they learn of it. Because they know how these folks are utilizing religiosity, racism, alienism, division to keep the fire burning. But the big one is going to be the launch of a hoaxed attack on the planet that would look 100% like an extraterrestrial event, and it is not. Now, when you also consider, anyone see Michael Jackson a couple years ago after he died in that holographic dance? Cool, huh? That's a declassified technology. You want to guess what's in the classified systems? You want to guess? 1,000 times better than that Michael Jackson on the stage. That looked 100% like him actually dancing. So let's begin to expose the fraud. Let's begin to expose this, not for the sake of rabble-rousing, but to awaken people to the danger. And then let's say, what are we going to do next? Because if you, look, you cannot, it's axiomatic, you cannot prove a negative, right? You already know that you can't prove a negative. However, if there were civilizations out there that were a threat to Earth and humanity, I think we'd know it by now. Secondly, if they are out there and they're operating sub rosa in a nefarious way, what's the solution to that? Weapon systems? When you're dealing with civilizations that are trans-dimensional interstellar, where they have a weapon system that they could hit a planet with a energy field and turn it into a pink dust floating through space and destroy that entire sphere? That capability exists. No, that's not the answer. And Martin Luther King had it right, and Christ had it right, and Gandhi had it right. Those approaches are not the correct approach. So even if there was such an existential threat, it cannot be managed by warmongers and militarists and people with these other agendas. We need to put together what I called for years ago a council on interplanetary relations that is devoted to peace and space, to the wise elders and youngsters of the planet to work on this issue and deal with it openly. And this is something that is of the greatest import and urgency of anything in our lives. Because even if we bring out free energy and anti-gravity, but we live on this planet with the consciousness of division and hatred and warfare, that too will be weaponized, and it'll still destroy the planet. So that in and of itself isn't a solution. So this spiritual understanding of the essential oneness of life and the need for not just world peace, but universal peace. And that we are the generation, those of us living on Earth at this time between the mid-20th century and the mid-21st century. I always joke that those of us between puberty and senility. Unfortunately, I'm getting closer to the latter. I know I have 8 grandchildren. Scary, me being a grandfather. 4 daughters and 8 grandchildren. So 8 grandchildren, beautiful, beautiful beings. That we owe it to our children and to the generations coming behind us, after us. Because the way I understand this is that we're closing out one era in the human experience, several 100,000 years in development. We're opening another era that's about 500,000 years in length, a cycle, universal cycle. And that cycle, the hallmark of it is universal peace. It'll be a day not followed by night, is how it is said. That there'll be a period, we'll enter into peace on this planet and peace in space, but we will not slide back into the darkness of war, which has happened in the last cycle. There were periods of peace on Earth, like the Shambhala Kingdom and Enlightenment, but it always slid back into darkness. This next cycle is different. But how do you start that cycle? Is it not going to be some Ouija board in the sky or someone's going to come down? And it's not going to be ETs landing on the White House lawn. It's us, the children of Earth, understanding this and creating that reality. It's time. It's time for us to do that. Thank you very much. Let's take about a 15-minute break and we'll come back for some question and answers. All right. So are the webinar folks okay? You're good? You're hot? All right, thank you very much for returning on time. So we're going to go for about another 40 minutes. I'd like to entertain questions from the audience. I will repeat the question since there's no microphone. And I did want to thank Michael Schratt again for this. I mean, I didn't go through all this, but the camera can zoom in on this. It's sort of a composite of all these different sightings that have been reported for decades. Even back in the 60s, there was one from Venezuela, I believe. And the kind of aircraft there are that are anti-gravities. And just as you look at all these, imagine these and more. Now these are more conventional, that look a little similar with the B-2 stealth and the evolution of all those sort of aircraft. But these are in a deeper, more classified program that are the electromagnetogravitics. But then imagine that you have ones that could look like discs, you could have ones that could look like tubes, you could have one that look like triangular boomerangs, and these are all man-made. Now, again, as I said earlier, there are extraterrestrial vehicles that wouldn't be quite like this, but could be a similar shape. Diamond shape, saucer shape, disc, spherical, just a perfect sphere, which I've seen close up, and other shapes. And so this gets into the ability to piggyback. I call it piggybacking, where you have an ET event happen, you come in with something that's man-made, confuse people. Somebody has a contact experience with ETs, they come in and piggyback onto it and target that person with a man-made abduction experience. You have some, so this is how counterintelligence operates. And you have to begin to wire your brain like that to understand the sort of Machiavellian and convoluted ways that they practice the art of deception in the counterintelligence field. And if you don't learn that, then you're going to be vulnerable to being very, very deceived. And I think this is why sharing this information for me is really key right now, because I can't tell you that in X number of days an event's going to happen. All I can say is that there's an event that's been planned, and I know people who've been on the planning committees and on the operational tactical committees, agencies for this, that I've met with personally. And as I was saying at the break, someone asked me, this came up, one of the hardest things I've had to deal with is for every disclosure project witness, and if you want to find out more about what we do, it's SiriusDisclosure.com, S-I-R-I-U-S, like the star system, SiriusDisclosure.com. If you go to that site, you'll see there's just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of information and links to all these military witnesses, documents, what have you. But for every person up there, or that I have in my archive on film, there's at least 10 to 20 that I've interviewed who will not go on the record because they're afraid of reprisals and afraid of being tweeped, terminate with extreme prejudice, assassinated. So this threat is serious, and it's caused the best, but it puts me in an untenable situation, because I am hearing already echoing around the world in the UFO subculture howls at some of what I have shared tonight. And what I'd like to be able to do is bring forward 2 or 3 dozen of these men and women, a few women, who have been in these corporations and programs doing this. They won't do it, because like Rick Foch in Naval Research Labs, most of them have been told point blank, if you do, you're dead, and your family's dead. In fact, my military advisor for a number of years was in an unacknowledged special access project, and when they first formulated it, he was taken into an underground facility, an undisclosed underground facility, a SCIF, a Secure Communication Information or Intelligence Facility, called a SCIF. And all their electronics, watches, everything were taken away, and they went down, and there was the security enforcement officer for that operation had a gun, took a bullet out of the clip, and said, if any of you speak to anyone about this operation, and that includes your commanding officer, the president, anybody, a member of your family, this bullet will find you, and you are a dead man. And this is a man of the utmost credibility. So this sort of illegal operation that we have killed our own, and the funding mechanism for this aren't just the black budget of the United States. It's been drug running. I had a man who was an executive with Science Applications International Corporation and a former member of Congress who was Bush Sr.'s consigliere on a lot of this, who met with me back in the late 90s and confirmed to me the involvement in these rogue operations with the arms trade, the drug trade, and trafficking, and that it generated enormous revenues for them in untraceable cash. And some of these anti-gravity devices have been used to ferry drugs and arms around the world for this purpose. So this story gets deeper and deeper. We could be, if we were here for not 2 hours but 2 weeks, we wouldn't exhaust the sort of depravity that I've come across in these operations. And the one thing that this former congressman and member, this executive with Science Applications International Corporation, SAIC, it's a big contracting entity that deals with a lot of this, told me, he said, do you realize that there are 8,000, and this was back in '97, that we know that we had 8,000 people in a secret army dealing with this these movement of drugs, and that we have already killed 2,000 of them for minor infractions of security and secrecy. And they said, do you have any idea how ruthless and dangerous this group is? I said, yes, I do. And of course, I had found out some years before of this operation and had dealt with a woman in South Dakota who, with Senator Daschle, was trying to get to the bottom of one of the operating centers that was adjacent to her large sheep ranch she had, where they were transshipping drugs and using anti-gravity devices to move chemical weapons and drugs in and out of that facility. And this does sound like it gets deeper and deeper and crazier. But that's what you're dealing with these folks. And as that gentleman said 25 years ago, the truth is more bizarre than the fiction people believe. And if you speak the truth, no one will believe you. All I can do is tell you the truth as I've uncovered it. And if I had only one data point, one person sharing what I've shared tonight, I wouldn't have shared it. I have dozens. And in those dozens of people spanning many countries, not just the United States, these points have been confirmed. And in my own little way, all I can do, short of those folks stepping forward, is to share with you as forthrightly as I can the truth. So keep that in mind as you ask questions. I always tell people, be careful what you ask. You might get the answer. So with that, I'll entertain. Oh, we do. Awesome. Great. So let's hear. You can pass it to the nearest and dearest. Yes. Yes. Go ahead.
So my question, tonight you brought up Corey Goode and some around Gaia TV. And recently on your telecon you had last month, you brought up the same topic around some of the information and being somewhat skeptical about some of the information coming out of that programming. With things like what William Tompkins is bringing up, the idea of Solar Warden and some of those other groups operating out in space, what things are you skeptical of and what things are you in belief
He's
of?
asking, what am I skeptical of about things that have come out recently with Bill Tompkin and others? A lot. Okay, so here's the issue for me. You've got to have multiple points of corroboration, and the bigger the tale, the more the proof you got to have. Now, what I would say is that I believe these men are sharing what they believe to be true. I also know how easy it would be to provide information that is scripted about that, and that is seductive and interesting. But I'm very cautious about saying that there's dispositive evidence. The research, I mean, the volumes of research that I and other people have on this exist. Many people back in even the 80s have documented the military involvement with abductions. We now have an official with the Air Force counterintelligence confirming that. So there are certain things we can say we have confirmation of. There are other things that I wouldn't say it's impossible, because I don't think anything is impossible, but I also know how easy it would be, having gotten to know Dr. Fred Bell very well, and who had been in these deep intelligence programs and had been provided with information that was scripted to get him to say and do certain things. That I want to be cautious about it. So, and this is not about personalities. I mean, I don't want to get into this whole personality thing. And someone said, well, you know, it's not about that. I don't care about any of that. I care about people not assuming facts that aren't in evidence, but also being aware of the truth, that people who have been in those programs, deep intelligence programs that are in unacknowledged special access projects, often are given information that is not true so that they will convey it to others. And they are being used for that purpose. A great example of that is a man, it kind of broke my heart. There was anybody heard of a group called Blink-182? So back when they were a young group, there was a guy named Tom DeLonge that was following my work, and we met at their apex as a group, and they, you know, I'd go on stage with them and things like that back in the early 2000s. And he has since been brought in, as you know, from the WikiLeaks by General McCaskill out of Wright-Patterson, and some others who are feeding him disinformation about a threat so that it'll get to the young people, like the new movie Independence Day, where they had the recruiting ad, you know, from the Army, to get people to buy into this us versus them alienism. Now, I don't think Tom DeLonge is in any way a bad person. I think he, however, has been used to do that by General McCaskill and others, as have many other folks. So now people could say, my information, I've been used. Though you can argue this forever. All I'm doing is tonight trying to share my understanding of things. And where I end is where I started. Even if everything that is being said that is of a terrifying nature of things going on out in space or with this ET group or another, the only survivable operative system is the CE5, Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind system, where based on the principles of nonviolence and universal peace, we have a rapprochement with these civilizations, we establish communication with them, we develop a civilization on our planet. I don't think that is peaceful and nonviolent and does not go out into space violently. I don't think the solution to this problem is more war or better space weapons to target ET objects or each other between Russia and the United States. I don't see that that's the solution. Bigger and better or more fearsome weapons targeting each other or other civilization, this cannot be an answer. And I also then remind people that civilizations, if they had that clear intent and wanted to do something, it would be very easy to do. I mean, remember when we first detonated atomic weapons and this whole modern era of UFOs being seen all over the world, wherever there was an atomic weapons facility developing, both in the Soviet Union and America, Great Britain, France, everywhere. Well-documented disclosure project material. If they had wanted to just put a pause button on this civilization, they could have done it. They didn't. And by the way, at that point we had what? Vacuum tubes? They didn't even have integrated circuits yet. We got those from studying ET materials, as fiber optics and other things. So I don't really see where's the beef here. Well, you know, now some people would say, well, they're just biding their time and they're going to get us in this sort of way later, and all kinds of paranoid fantasies. I'd say, well, if that's the truth, then here's what I'd say to anyone who has that belief system and that paradigm. You're entitled to it. I would ask that you, if you have personal knowledge of those civilizations and have access to them, that you set up a meeting between me and the senior people on our interplanetary ambassador team to resolve differences and go forward peacefully. I still don't think the answer is in saber-rattling, warmongering, and demonizing other racial species. That's alienism. One of the other concerns I have is that with many of these people, you'll hear that the ones that look Nordic, shall we say, I was talking to, I've spent 3 or 4 hours with Bill Tompkins, and the ones that kind of look like us, but are pretty, those are good ones. The ones that look some other way, those are bad ones. Isn't that interstellar racism? All right, it's just, I mean, take a step back. Aren't the good ones always the pretty blonde ones with the big breasts and the, no, I mean, unfortunately this is really true. I mean, you talk to, and then the others are, I find it appalling. I mean, I really go, are we really going to stay on that cycle of taking racism and turning it into alienism and finding some way? Now, ultimately, as I said earlier, I cannot prove a negative. I can't prove there are no civilizations out there that are worse than we are, although it would be hard to find worse than human society right now. However, if there are, I still say the solution is contact, communication, conflict resolution within the construct of universal consciousness and universal peace. And so I prefer not to just get into an endless battle, because it's an argument that will never end. The only reason I brought it up at all is because I'm concerned that places like Gaia TV or Conscious Evolution could be given information out there that is being scripted and being provided unwittingly from these folks. I mean, and sincerely, that if it is true, let's say that the slave races are out there and the slave planets and the slave ships and all this is going on that you hear in some of the accounts from Corey Goode and others. If that were true, and that then is put out by into the public domain to then millions and eventually billions of people, in the minds of most people out here on the street, that would justify interplanetary war. And so we have to be very careful. What I'm trying to say here is that we have a responsibility here to protect the human consciousness. I'm not saying to cover things up or just not disclose things that are true, but to ask the questions, who would benefit from that kind of Manichaean, good and bad alienism paradigm, and the demonization of one group and the exaltation of another ET group? Wouldn't that build into the same dynamic that on Earth has gotten us to the brink of Armageddon? And isn't there a better way of looking at this? Isn't there a different way, not better, different way, that could lead to a world of peace here and peace with humanity, with these other civilizations? That's what I'm saying. And it is not at all to throw a wet blanket on anyone's parade. It's simply to say there's a responsibility here to look at it very carefully and understand that there are consequences to these kind of tales, and that you better be able to prove it, and even if you can, here's the solution. Now there, Corey Goode and I would agree 100%. And we agree, I think, I have never met the gentleman, I think on a lot we agree 100%. However, on some of the things that are being shared as factual secret space program activities that have no other real good points of corroboration, and which I know, given how he was in the military abduction programs and what they are capable of, some of the experiences he has had, I'm concerned, have been scripted and may not reflect anything actually out there in deep space. Because I have my own experiences out in deep space, and I'm not going to go too far into that here today, but I have a different understanding of it. And I also understand that the sort of folks, and this is a soul-searching issue for all of us, the sort of folks who would put into the consciousness, mind, and experience of various people what has been shared about the secret space program have had the ability for 60 years to do it in a way that would be very convincing but completely scripted. That's why I spent that whole section talking about the electromagnetic psychotronic radionic systems that were developed in the 50s. And this is also why I think that I'd rather be cautious about this. And my concern is that when you have rock stars and other people, and then millions of people who otherwise would be New Age, progressive, whatever, buying into a Manichaean black and white, us versus them, good and bad, they're just being brought into alienism. They're being brought into a paradigm that supports interplanetary war. And my question is always, who would benefit from that kind of information? Now, I'm not someone who says that if there are such, let's call them misguided and dangerous elements out in other star systems, that we would want to ignore them. But I just think that we would want to discuss them and characterize them and interact with them in a different way. And I know that the folks who have been in the military programs connected to Mr. Tompkins and others have an agenda. And I question that agenda has to do with the propagation of fear and the convincing of the public that there's an existential threat, as Ronald Reagan said at the UN, that would unite the world to fight. And the purpose of that is this aggregation of more power. Because right now you have different coalitions around the world. If there was a threat from outer space, then all those different conflicting coalitions, whether it be Russia or America or China, developed world, would come together, just like the movie Independence Day, to unite to fight the ETs, the aliens. And I think that having talked to so many folks who've been involved over decades in those operations and the extent to which they have the ability to make that happen, I approach this with extreme caution. And for that reason, I would ask other people to, that calmer heads need to prevail here. That my interest is a future that is marked by universal peace, not endless war. Now, if we stampede the public into all kinds of frightening information from the past or what we're seeing as the future, and that is then used the way 9/11 was used, or the way the Iraq weapons of mass destruction were used, or the Gulf of Tonkin were used, and I know that that's the plan, then we could end up with the mass panic in the public being utilized to aggregate more power around the militarists and the military-industrial complex and those uber elites who want to sit atop the world manipulating everyone in an us versus them worldview. And I thought to myself, I'm not going to say who this man was. There was a head of a religious organization back in the 90s, I believe, when I met with him. Very large global organization. And when we were talking about this, and this is a man who's dedicated his life to world peace and to enlightenment, as soon as he heard of the ET issue, he says, oh, and this is not someone in the cabal, this is a man on the street, sort of, but a big figure internationally. That'd be great, because if the public finds out about aliens, we can have world peace because we can unite everyone against a threat from out there. He went from A to B like Ronald Reagan, like that. And this is a man otherwise of enormous enlightenment. I'm telling you, this is the danger. This is the thing that my wife and I talk about probably more than anything over the last 25 years about this issue, is me getting off the stage, because I don't want disclosure of this subject to then be used and hijacked for the purpose of saying, yes, there are ETs, but guess what? They're here to eat us for lunch, and now we have to have World War III. I don't want, see what I'm saying? I have to tell you, that's why I'm here tonight, because this is what keeps me awake at night. This is my biggest fear. My biggest fear is that disclosing this information gets hijacked and spun into this War of the Worlds, Independence Day kind of scenario, and that I would have forsaken my medical career and spent 26 years of my life and had very close friends murdered to add fire to interplanetary war? No. That's not, I don't want that to be what I'm working on. And as I see it, groups that are otherwise very dedicated with a view of a conscious, evolved world, or Gaia, an enlightened, awake planet, as a platform where so much of that, some of that information is then portraying various ET races as these horrific, torturing, slave trading, species. And I think to myself, wow, they've already got the warmongers. They could get the man on the street by hoaxing something. Now they're trying to co-opt even the progressive community. I'm being very blunt, and I know that I will get a lot of emails complaining. And it isn't about that. I mean, I've always had a policy to try to avoid talking about personalities. But I'm just deeply concerned that there is a juggernaut. And I think that we have to think about what are we doing to the world in the human consciousness when terrifying aspects of interstellar civilizations are presented as absolute fact, when there's the possibility there is this dark hand of the intelligence community that has scripted this and hoaxed it. What are those implications? They're huge. And I think there is a moral and ethical question here. And I will be honest with you, that's the only reason I'm doing this tonight. I think this is a matter of enormous moral and ethical concern that is not being discussed properly and fully. And I think we have to, I would rather stop everything I'm doing than to propel further disclosure if what it leads to is piggybacking onto disclosure, this fearsome new world order of interplanetary conflict and hatred. That is not what I've dedicated my life to. So that's my big concern. I'm being as honest, speaking from my heart as I can. Other questions? Yes, sir.
So, like recently, as you spoke about with Independence Day, and one I saw a few nights ago, The Arrival, which was wasn't very violent, but all these movies coming out with, I mean, it's totally obvious, the propaganda in it. Thank you. When it comes down to it, because all the kids my age, I know that they all view this whole world like Independence Day Resurgence, which was perfect in terms of displaying what the world would turn out to be. When it comes down to that, we're all kind of being geared in this direction of war and hatred, as you just explained.
Yeah, manipulated.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
What, especially to the younger generations, what is the best shot in terms of trying to enlighten people on this subject? I know you've spoken of getting free energy out, spiritual awakening, and all those things, but what do you think is the best shot to get us out of this world?
Well, I think that, to unlock this in a way that people will get behind and not be afraid of, and it is to speak the truth, which is what I'm trying to do, and people need to speak it to their own colleagues and cohorts. But I think the other thing we're wanting to do, although we haven't quite got it set up yet, we're wanting to do a disclosure concert that would have the top music acts in the world. Anybody out there, let's get the Foo Fighters and Bono of U2 and Lady Gaga and Katy Perry and everyone on a stage, and doing something so that a message that we're not alone, the universe is there, but in a way that says, now what's the next phase in human society? The next stage is not just internationalism and globalism at all. It's interplanetary, and it's enlightened, and it's an enlightened civilization. And I think this is something that, if people understand what the implications are of the secrecy, that 100 years of conscious evolution on this planet has been robbed by classified projects that have kept these technologies in a box and are now misusing them and have been misusing them for 60 years on people and hoaxing events rather than running your house and car. So there's no pollution. So people who care about the environment, people who care about world poverty, you need to connect. That what I tried to do beginning back in the 90s was to connect those dots. That the secrecy is anathema to a civilization that's sustainable and peaceful and just. So people who are concerned about that can be gathered together. And that's most people on the earth. The vast majority of people on the earth do not benefit from fossil fuels and nuclear power and secrecy. It's a very small number of people. And those people who would be displaced in a free energy economy, because at that point you've got such abundance, as a tide that'll lift the whole world, can be taken care of very easily and brought into other occupations besides digging up things and burning them or exploding them. So there is a way to get us out of this. And one thing I do want to say is that I am incredibly, I think the near term is fraught. I'm not going to say it's easy. One thing about being an emergency doctor, you come into my ER and you have a headache and I find a brain tumor, I ain't going to tell you you got a migraine. I'm going to tell you you got a brain tumor. So right now the humanity has a metastatic tumor of corruption and secrecy, which needs to get treated. So we have to acknowledge where we are. But I'm fully confident that we can recover from this and we can begin a civilization that will allow us to do what I call a time snap, where we could and should have been 100 years ago with free energy from Tesla, et cetera, and so on, we could get to that in 15 years. By the time this young man is in college or past, we would have no pollution, no poverty, things that float instead of highways digging up the ground, and the beginning of an interstellar relationship with other planets that's peaceful. I think that's something that can happen very, very quickly once it begins to happen. But we need a critical mass of people coming together as a movement to do it. And so that's where the energy for me. And I think that I had a beautiful lucid dream about a year ago, almost exactly. So great you asked this question. And it was a lucid dream with a group of ETs, beautiful. And they specifically said you need to be doing things to reach the young generation, the next generation. And I was told those between 15 and 34 or something like that, you know, like that. And it was very specific. And I've still been searching for a way to do it because, you know, I'm sort of an anachronism. I mean, I don't mean to sound like a, you know, over the hill, but I do still bench press 410 pounds. So most of the buddies I have in their 20s, they come tangle with me. In fact, my son-in-law will say, we're going to make it a club to take on Papa. That's my name for the grandchildren, Papa. Because I'm a beast. But I think that but I think that that this really is a great issue, and my guidance in the contact I've had with these interstellar people is that we really do need to get the involvement of folks who are from their late teens into their 30s heavily involved in this. But it doesn't need to be through Tom DeLonge saying, you know, there's evil aliens out there and the military's doing a great job of kicking alien butt, which if you distill a lot of what he's been saying on Coast to Coast and other shows is about that bad. So we need to have voices that are providing information. I'm sorry, Tom, because I mean, we've known each other for a long time. This is all very painful for me. I guess you're gathering that. But that we have got to find a way to speak of this and act in a way that redounds to a beautiful future, not a disastrous one. And so I think that that's why we need to explain to people in their 20s and 30s that this world is going to be your world very soon. It is your world now, but you're going to be running it. And what do you want to have? You want to have endless war? You want to take 9/11 in Iraq and Afghanistan and then expand it to interplanetary war? Do you want to have another 100 years of global environmental destruction? Or do you want to have world peace, universal peace, free energy? And it needs to be said that starkly to everyone, from China to Russia to all over the world. And the reason I would love to organize a concert, a global music festival that would be live streamed all over the world is for that message to reach younger people. Yeah. So those of you who can help make that happen, give me a jingle. Okay, a couple more questions. Well, let's do, we don't want to ignore this group. Or someone in the middle.
I want to ask you, how can a person authenticate the difference between in the dreams and sightings, in the dreams and in the sightings that people experience, how can they authenticate the real genuine article versus phony, illusional things? Like when you said you had a lucid dream with, how do you know that's real and that's not a directed operation type of situation?
That's right. And this is a great question because, you know, how do you know? Well, you have to be brutally honest with yourself And you also have to know enough that there could be both. If you don't know there could be both, you're never going to ask the question, was it one or the other, right? Whether it was ET or some man-made electronic warfare system. So knowing that is the first step. Then the second step is looking at how it unfolded. And were there, and I've actually interviewed a number of people who had really clear memories of an alien abduction, but then when they go deeper into their memory, there were people who were directing these robotic aliens. Now that's gotten covered up in a lot of the abduction research. So a part of it is looking at this and beginning to question everything. And I think if anything, tonight what I'd like to tell people is question everything and begin to look at everything very freshly.
From a mechanical point of view.
But from a mechanical point of view, distinguishing an interstellar vehicle from a man-made, that's pretty easy. When I take teams out, the phenomenon that happens that's interstellar, that's transdimensional and interstellar has a very distinctly feel and look versus an invasive. Now we've had both happen. We have had man-made intrusions into our contact sites, and it's quite obvious. It didn't fool anybody. They were hoping it would, but it didn't. So a lot of that is experience and how it happens, whether it's invasive, how it feels, how it looks, knowing what the technologies are. So in a couple hours I can only go through so much data, but this is something that's really a subject. When I take people on a whole week intensive, this is information we go into very deeply, where we go out under the stars at night. During the afternoon we're doing all of this information and remote viewing training so that you can remote view. And ultimately we set up experiments so that we can see if our discernment is being tricked or not. Yeah, for remote viewing.
On your website?
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of information, and there's actually training programs on the website and everything else at SeriousDisclosure.com. Yes, so someone back here. Yes, ma'am.
I'm wondering, as far as free energy goes, is there a groundwork being laid for people to come out with that kind of technology? I know my dad, for one, was given a technology, and he's had his life threatened. And I know that there's a lot of people that are really brilliant, but there's not been a groundwork placed for them to be able to come out with this technology in a safe way, and also in a way that, I mean, these technologies are expensive. You know what I mean? Those things don't. So, is there a way for this to
There is. That's a great question about the free energy, so-called 0 point. The groundwork has been laid. We've been laying it for 20 years. And if you go to our website, also look at a program I did. It was a 4-hour program similar to this on free energy and the history of it and what the strategy is to bring it out. Without going through 4 hours of material, which is already up on our site, on our YouTube channel, it's youtube.com/S-disclosure, S as in serious, but S-disclosure. By the way, this movie, Sirius, is up there. It's had about 1 million views now. Yeah, they're quite interesting, yeah. And last year it was the #1 documentary on Netflix. But what I would say is that if someone actually has something like that operational, they need to get hold of me immediately. But they need to be prepared to dump it on the internet, no holds barred. Forget patenting. Forget intellectual property, forget secrecy. All those are traps in the system to keep it from coming out. Moreover, don't sit on it. Okay, so the people who sit on these technologies and don't have a few 100 million people know about it are going to be dead. The people who sit on it and don't put it out open source are going to either have it bought out and black shelved, put on a black shelf, or they're going to end up disappearing. Now, this is a fact. So I have analyzed with a lot of people who have been in the intelligence community for much longer, some of them almost as long as I've been alive, that there's one pathway out, and that is open source it, disclose it massively, and get it out there and have it reproducible. Now, if anyone has anything, I have a team of people, engineers, I have people on my team, some of them have private planes and jets. We can get it and we can secure it, and you know, if they take me out, you're going to know why I was taken out. Because I recently went on a mission, it turned out the person didn't have anything, it was they had mismeasured the energy output and input. But before I went on that expedition to this inventor, I had dead man triggers all over the place, meaning that if anything happened to me, everything got out, everything went out. So you need to have, and one of the good things about being a public figure like I am now, where I can reach millions and millions and millions of people, is that it's very difficult to keep me off the radar scope. And so I would say, pass it on, hand it off to me. Now, if someone says, I've worked for 20 years and put X amount of, I have folks on my team now who can make that person whole financially. I mean, I can't, because I've given up about $12 million of my income as a doctor doing this stuff, believe it or not. I mean, you figure $500,000–600,000 a year for this long, do the math. You know, can you do math? But my point is that there are people that we've reached in the last year or two that can help make this happen. However, it can't happen unless the technology can be tested, independently reproduced. We have people to do it or aren't going to hoax the results. And then while that's happening, massively disclosed on the internet. And when I say massively, streamed on Facebook Live, streamed on YouTube, streamed on everything. The danger is if you have a technology like this and you think you're going to outsmart these devils, you're going to be one dead son of a bitch. All right? Okay, so the only way out is squeeze the toothpaste out of the tube and get it out. Now, there are people who say, well, I don't want to do that, it's too dangerous, then let me do it. I mean, I've been taking the shots for a quarter of a century, and I'm still here by some miracle. So, it has been a miracle. So, I think that I'm willing to do that, because if someone threatens me, it'd be the worst day of their life. I'm not going to go any further than that. But there are interests that do not want this project to fail. But I can't do it. I mean, I'm a doctor. I'm not an electrical engineer, mechanical engineer. But if someone has something operational and plans that make it reproducible, and it can be independently vetted, i.e. the scientific method, and they will allow us to massively disclose it and be honest with you, get out of the way. It's like when code blue, you're going to have to defibrillate someone with 360 joules of electricity, and if you're touching that body, you get electrocuted. Zap. People need to get clear, unless they want to be in that arena. But it is the very big league of taking on the worst special interests who want to stop it. I'm willing to do it. I've been willing to do it for decades. Unfortunately, my group has never taken clear possession of something that we're allowed to disclose. I've seen technologies, and we've tested some, but the people want to play spy versus spy, and I'm going to keep it quiet and proprietary, and I'm going to outfox the intelligence community by dividing the technology into 100 patents we'll never know. I said, by the time you have the thought about what you're going to do, these devils have technologies that have pulled that thought out of your consciousness. And I am not exaggerating. If you think you're going to outfox those people, that is a fool's errand. So listen to me carefully when I say this. The only way that these technologies are going to come out is to get out of the paradigm of worrying about monetization and productization and capitalizing on it at the first stage of it. Now, down the road, my proposal, I have a proposal that I've written called the New Earth Energy Incubator. And what that is like Google has an incubator fund, and other people do, where you put resources in and you create these technologies, but you do it like GitHub. Everybody know what GitHub is? It's a software engineering, and it's open source, and it's just shared. It's not proprietary. But it's become actually incredibly successful. So there is a way to do this where we do it open source, multiple points of collaboration, and you take something that is a level 1 free energy system and move it to a level 500 in 12 months by open source and collaboration. That could happen, but someone has to be willing to understand why this strategy exists. It isn't that I'm trying to rob anyone of their hard work. It's because I'm trying to save their life. And I'll give you an example. The Orion project, which is an energy division of my operation, you can see on our website, we were bidding with a group, we didn't know who they were, to get the Stan Meyer, you know, the water-fueled car. But that wasn't what we really were after. In that collection was a toroid, a donut-shaped electromagnetic system that had a national security order on it from the 80s. And it was in the collection, and we were given a heads up about it by someone who had worked with Stan Meyer. So my group only had a few $100,000. A group out of Michigan came in with several million and outbid us. And I said at the time, if they do this secretively in a proprietary way, they are in mortal danger. I've just had it confirmed in March that they've all been assassinated. So, yes. And so the problem with the engineers and physicists and inventors is that they may be brilliant in that area, but they don't know what the strategy has to be here. That's what I want to do. My wife has to hook up the computers and TV. I don't do that. You know, I mean, I'll break it. You know, give me a defibrillator, I'm fine. But I think you need someone who can be a Sherpa, a guide, through the intelligence community and the strategy on this, and that's what I would offer to do if I found anyone with the technology. Now, unfortunately, usually people are going to take the big buyout, all right? So, or they're going to want to try to keep it proprietary, or they're going to try to keep it patented and secret. All those conventional business things that works fine with an iPhone or what have you is fatal, and I mean literally fatal, with a free energy system. And I've been trying to educate people about this for a very long time, but what I've seen over the last 20 years is, I mean, you know, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over expecting a different result. I see the same mistakes, and there's a set number of them that these people have made over and over again. And each person who comes along with a discovery on this area of technology, 0 point and what have you, they think they've got you know, the world by the tail. Well, as I've said, they think that the whole world's going to come knocking on their door offering them, you know, everything. And I said the first knock on the door is going to be Murder Incorporated. And unfortunately, those folks, or they're going to be very wealthy and the technology's gone. Now, I know some people personally who have had technologies, are now decamillionaires or centimillionaires, who took a whole lot of money and the technology's on a black shelf. But that doesn't benefit the world. Now that person's very wealthy, but what good does that do the world? Now I think we have to think, again, how do we develop a strategy that accounts for the reality of the world we live in, not the world we'd like it to be. The world we live in have people who are vicious at wanting to suppress this technology, and they will do everything in their means to see it is kept out of the public domain. Therefore, the only way to get it out to benefit the human race initially is to not worry about the money part of it. Now, if the person really has a lot of assets tied up in its development, I'm not going to mention any names, but I can tell you on my speed dial list are people who could make those people whole financially. But hand it off to us, ain't going to go into a black hole with me. It's going to be on the internet as soon as I have the proof that it works. And maybe before, although I don't want to have egg on my face. I've had egg on my face before. But so any of you who know someone with a system like this, have them contact me, and we will liberate it for the people of Earth. Let's see, it's getting a little late, but I'll take one more question. Yes, from this young lady.
It's connected, but it's yeah. Anyway, so you talked about like projected images and holograms and etc.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts about plant medicine, like ayahuasca, as far as like for example, as far as like healing the people and uniting people and getting people to this level of to this heart frequency that
Right.
you know that we need to get to the next step. And what are your thoughts about that?
And she's asking about plant medicine and specifically ayahuasca. My own view of it is that I think there are, and I'm very non-judgmental about any of these issues. I'm a Vedanta, Vedic person. So Sanskrit and the Vedas and consciousness being developed through meditative techniques, I find a safer, faster, and more permanent way of reaching those states of consciousness. Now, there are native peoples around the world that have had plant substances that have facilitated. My worry about it in our current culture is that it becomes a point of someone needing to do it more than once or twice as having an epiphany. And we're famous in the West for then abusing the substance instead of using it. So what I would say is that if we had the restraint and the wisdom of the ancient people, I think probably some of those could have a role. I'm not saying it doesn't have a role for some people now, because everyone has to make an individual choice. My own path on this, in terms of the development of human consciousness and healing, is to understand the primacy of consciousness, experience it, and use sort of your innate abilities without any sort of outside sources. Now, that's just my own perspective. It's worked for me, and it works for my people I train for contact and remote viewing experiences. And I think that in the long run, it may, for some people, be more arduous and require more self-discipline, but has, in the long run, a more lasting effect over time. So that's just my own perspective about it. But on the other hand, I don't judge in a negative way at all people who might, want to try different things to, and by the way, as a physician, in terms of medical marijuana and things like that, I think it's ridiculous it's illegal. I mean, there are a lot of things that are illegal that are ridiculous that they're illegal, and I'll go on the record there. I had to have surgery about 11 months ago for something, and the surgeon wrote me for 60 Percocets. I took one, it made me so sick. And all I could say is, where can I find some, because we're in Virginia, you go to prison. And they're watching me like a hawk, so I can't do anything. But, there are certain things that our society is so stupid. Well, I was set up to be put in prison for 3 years by the jackbooted fascists in the National Park Service. I took a group to meditate and pray on a beach in North Carolina. We got permits to be there at night. The person who gave the permits worked for the permitting office until a month before she came out with us. But her best friend was the chief ranger. They set us up. The federal justice system tried to put me in prison for 3 years for meditating for universal peace on a beach. True story. I had to go to federal court, pay a $5,000 fine, and I stand before you, a convict with a misdemeanor, for having had a group of a few people sitting on a beach praying and meditating. That is how fascistic our federal system is. Anyway, but what I would say is that, I encourage people to really explore how to develop higher states of consciousness through meditative states and other states, and look at what they have within themselves. I think everything we need to develop the high, and I was talking about this yesterday at Paula Harris's conference, everything we need to attain to every state of higher consciousness, we already have sitting within us. It's all in us, hardware, software. And it's all about the practicing of the techniques. So I would encourage people to do that. One last question, and then that'll be it. Oh, we'll go over here. She's getting a workout. I guess we needed 2 mics in.
So my question is, I know you're accepting donations online to help bring out the free energy thing. You said you need about like $6.3 million.
Well, man.
I just wanted to know, are you accepting donations right now?
Yes, we are. I mean, I think that if you go on at seriousdisclosure.com, we have a whole section about.
Like here.
Oh, like here? Sure. Yes, of course. But thank you. Yeah, and people who want to help support that. And what I think we also want to be able to say is, We need people who understand what the environmental consequences are to this secrecy, who then begin to fund, not myself, but engineers and inventors and technical people who understand this, but who have been tinkering in their garages with no support for decades. I think that it's really something that has to get some serious institutional support behind it, and the public could do it. I think that we could even crowdfund it if we just had a prototype that put out 100 watts that was provable and open source. Because, you know, this movie, Unacknowledged, is now the second highest funded documentary in history. Someone came out with a smart water cooler that they raised $10 million for. I don't see why, if we had, it was a beer cooler or something that had like a smartphone for beer guys, you know, going to the stadium. But I think that if we had even one proof of principle prototype that we could disclose openly, we could then open source or crowdsource the funding for it. But I also know that there are people who get behind it. In the meanwhile, we need support to do, if someone doesn't come forward with something operational that they'll let go forward, we need to find people who will support basic science R&D. And you know, this isn't happening at universities, and it's not happening in corporations, because as soon as someone starts on that path, I know some universities and others have, they get shut down. So this is why it has to be done with the whole world watching. My view of it, if this was a laboratory and you had people in there, all the work at all the workstations would be streamed online live. The results would be released live in real time, but the actual work would be. So that there would be, see, this idea is very, you couldn't have done this 10 years ago. Now you can do it. So that, how do they shut that down? All right? And now you'd have to have some good internet security. But you do this because then if you have millions and millions of people begin to see this process, not only do they learn it in real time and begin to replicate it all over the world, so the cat's out of the bag, but you have the security umbrella of millions of people knowing, so that if these devils come in, they're caught red-handed shutting it down. And then people will march in the streets and say no more. So the technology didn't exist to do this 10 years ago. It does now. So that's what I'd like to see us organize on the technology front. Thank you very much. Well, look, I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in and being here. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you.